Welcome, fellow night owls and history enthusiasts, to another journey into the shadows of the past. Before we venture into the smoke-filled saloons and dusty frontier towns of the Wild West, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you settling in for sleep in Chicago, winding down after a long day in Denver, or perhaps watching the sunrise somewhere across the pond? Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are. If these explorations into America's grittiest chapters help you unwind, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Now, make yourself comfortable and prepare to step into a world where survival meant cunning, where respectability was a luxury few could afford, and where women carved out their own brutal form of independence in the most unforgiving of circumstances. Tonight, we're pulling back the swinging doors of the Frontier Saloon to reveal the harsh reality behind the painted smiles and tawdry glamour. The Wild West we see in Hollywood films, with their romanticized gunfighters and noble outlaws, barely scratches the surface of what life was truly like on the American frontier. For most women, the West offered few opportunities beyond marriage, domestic service, or the oldest profession known to humanity. In a land where men outnumbered women sometimes 20-1, where law was often nothing more than the barrel of a gun, and where survival trumped morality at every turn, the saloon became both sanctuary and prison for countless women seeking to make their way in an unforgiving world. The madame who ran the establishment and the women who worked under her roof lived lives of constant contradiction. They wielded a kind of power that few women of their era could claim, controlling their own earnings, making business decisions, and commanding respect through fear and cunning. Yet this power came at a price that would break most souls, paid in violence, disease, addiction, and the slow erosion of hope that perhaps, someday, there might be a different kind of life waiting beyond the saloon doors. Tonight, as the wind howls across the prairie and the distant sound of a harmonica drifts through the darkness, we'll walk in the footsteps of these forgotten women. We'll see how a young farm girl from Missouri might find herself transformed into a hardened businesswoman running a string of establishments across 3 territories. We'll witness the daily brutalities and small victories that defined their existence. And we'll come to understand how survival in the Wild West required a kind of strength that history has largely chosen to forget. The saloon doors are swinging open, the piano is playing a melancholy tune, and the amber glow of oil lamps illuminates faces that have seen too much. Step carefully, for the floorboards creak with secrets, and every shadow holds a story of desperation, determination, and the relentless human drive to endure against impossible odds. Picture, if you will, a ramshackle building on the main street of some forgotten frontier town. The paint is peeling, the wood is weathered grey by countless storms, and the only signs of prosperity are the red curtains in the upstairs windows and the steady stream of men who pass through those doors from sundown to sunrise. This is where our story begins, in the smoky, gin-soaked world of the frontier bordello, where women learned that survival meant becoming harder than the men who sought to break them. The year is 1873, and 16-year-old Mary Catherine Sullivan steps off the stagecoach in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of introduction to a woman known only as Big Nose Kate. Mary's journey west began 3 months earlier, when her family's farm in Missouri was foreclosed upon, leaving her parents dead of cholera and her siblings scattered to the winds. The letter, pressed into her trembling hands by a traveling preacher who claimed to know of opportunities for young women in the territories, promised honest work and a fresh start. What Mary found instead was a world that would strip away every illusion she'd ever held about decency, morality, and the nature of human desperation. Big Nose Kate, whose real name was Catherine Elder, ran one of Deadwood's most notorious establishments with an iron fist and a loaded derringer always within reach. Kate had arrived in the territories years earlier under circumstances not unlike Mary's, and she'd learned that in a world where women were seen as either angels or property, there was power to be found in embracing neither role completely. The first lesson Mary learned was that survival in Kate's world required abandoning any notions of shame or propriety she might have carried from her former life. The work was what it was, Kate explained in her matter-of-fact way, and those who couldn't stomach it were free to find their fortune elsewhere. But elsewhere, for a young woman with no family, no connections, and no skills beyond keeping house and minding children, meant starvation, or worse. Kate's establishment operated under a strict hierarchy that governed every aspect of daily life. At the top sat Kate herself, who handled all business dealings, managed the money, and dispensed justice with a swift and often violent hand. Below her were the more experienced women, some of whom had been in the life for years and had learned to navigate its treacherous currents with a mixture of cunning and brutality that would have shocked their former selves. These veteran women served as both mentors and tormentors to newcomers like Mary, teaching them the unwritten rules that meant the difference between survival and destruction. Never show fear, even when facing down a drunk cowboy with a knife. Never trust anyone completely, not even the other women, because desperation could turn friend into enemy in the space of a heartbeat. Never save money in ways that could be discovered, because Kate took her cut of everything, and women who tried to hold back faced consequences that served as object lessons for the rest. The daily routine began before noon, when the women would wake in their cramped shared rooms above the saloon. The lucky ones had rooms with windows. The rest made do with spaces barely larger than closets, furnished with little more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and perhaps a trunk for their few possessions. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist in Kate's world, and the thin walls meant that everyone's business was everyone else's business. Mornings were spent preparing for the evening's work, a process that involved far more than simply putting on a dress and painting their faces. Each woman was responsible for maintaining her own appearance, which meant mending torn clothing, washing and styling hair without the benefit of proper facilities, and creating the illusion of health and vitality, even when racked with illness or exhaustion. The cosmetics available to frontier women were crude and often dangerous, made from lead-based powders that gradually poisoned those who used them, and rouge that contained mercury and other toxic substances. Yet the painted face was armor in this world, a mask that allowed women to become someone else, someone who could endure what Mary Catherine Sullivan from Missouri never could have survived. Kate demanded that her women present themselves as ladies, even as they engaged in the most unladylike of professions. This meant learning to walk, talk, and carry themselves with a dignity that belied their circumstances. For many, this performance became so ingrained that the line between who they had been and who they pretended to be gradually disappeared entirely. The economics of the establishment were brutal in their simplicity. Kate took a percentage of everything, from the drinks the women encouraged customers to buy to the money earned upstairs. Room and board were deducted from earnings, as were the costs of clothing, cosmetics, and medical care when available. What remained was often barely enough to survive on, let alone save for some imagined future escape from the life. Yet within this system of exploitation, some women managed to carve out their own forms of power and independence. The smart ones learned to read their customers, to identify the lonely men who might be convinced to part with extra money for nothing more than conversation and companionship. They learned which customers were dangerous and which could be trusted, which lawmen could be bought, and which posed genuine threats to the operation. Mary's education in this world was swift and often painful. She learned that a smile could disarm a violent drunk, that tears could sometimes buy mercy from a cruel customer, and that showing weakness was an invitation for others to exploit it. She discovered that loyalty in Kate's establishment was a fluid concept, shifting based on circumstances and opportunities. and that survival often meant making choices that would have horrified the farm girl she'd once been. The violence that permeated frontier life was especially concentrated in places like Kate's Saloon. Men arrived already primed for trouble, their pockets full of money from cattle drives or mining claims, their minds clouded by alcohol and months of isolation. Fights erupted over perceived slights, card games turned deadly, and women caught in the crossfire learned to duck first and ask questions later. Kate herself was no stranger to violence, and she ruled her establishment through a combination of cunning and carefully applied brutality. She kept a loaded shotgun behind the bar and wasn't hesitant to use it when customers got out of line. More than one troublemaker found himself face down in the street outside, nursing a headache and wondering how a woman half his size had gotten the better of him. But Kate's violence wasn't reserved only for unruly customers. Women who broke the rules, who tried to cheat her out of money, or who posed threats to the stability of the operation faced punishments that served as reminders to the others. These could range from beatings to temporary exile from the establishment, which in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, amounted to a kind of social death sentence. For Mary, watching Kate dispense this rough justice was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. In a world where women were typically at the mercy of male violence, here was a woman who had learned to wield power through force when necessary. It was a lesson that would serve Mary well in the years to come, as she gradually transformed from a frightened farm girl into someone who could hold her own in the most dangerous situations. The customers who frequented Kate's establishment represented a cross-section of frontier society, from cowboys and miners to traveling salesmen and local businessmen who maintained respectable facades during daylight hours. Each type of customer required a different approach, and the women learned to read men like books, identifying their needs, fears, and weaknesses within moments of meeting them. The cowboys were often the most dangerous, arriving in town after months on the trail with pockets full of money and attitudes shaped by violence and isolation. They drank hard, fought harder, and treated women as objects to be conquered rather than human beings deserving of basic respect. Yet they were also often the most generous with their money, and women who could handle their rough ways often found themselves earning more in a single night than others made in a week. Miners presented their own challenges, arriving from remote claims with gold dust burning holes in their pockets and social skills dulled by months of solitude. They could be unpredictable, swinging between maudlin sentimentality and explosive rage with little warning. Some carried fortunes in gold, while others had nothing but empty promises and tales of strikes that would make them rich someday. The businessmen and local politicians who visited the establishment were perhaps the most hypocritical of Kate's customers, maintaining public personas as pillars of the community while engaging in behavior that would have scandalized their wives and neighbors. These men often demanded the most discretion and were willing to pay premium prices for it, making them valuable but dangerous clients. Each woman developed her own strategies for dealing with different types of customers. Some specialized in playing the innocent young thing, wide-eyed and eager to please. Others cultivated an air of worldly sophistication, positioning themselves as confidants and advisors to men seeking more than physical satisfaction. The most successful learned to be chameleons, adapting their personalities to match whatever their customers seemed to need. Mary discovered that she had a talent for listening, for making men feel heard and understood in ways their lives often didn't allow. Cowboys would tell her about the loneliness of the trail, miners would share their dreams of striking it rich, and businessmen would confess their fears about failure and financial ruin. This emotional labor was as much a part of the job as anything else, and those who could provide it often found themselves with regular customers who paid well for the privilege of being understood. But emotional connections in this world were dangerous things because they made women vulnerable to exploitation and heartbreak. Mary learned to maintain a careful distance, to provide the illusion of intimacy, without ever truly opening herself to the pain that genuine connection might bring. It was a survival skill that served her well, even as it gradually hardened something essential within her. The daily rhythms of life in Kate's establishment were dictated by the flow of customers and the demands of the business. Afternoons were spent preparing for the evening rush, with women taking turns at the single mirror to apply their makeup and arrange their hair. The lucky ones had decent dresses, while others made do with whatever garments they could afford or had managed to salvage from previous situations. Evening brought the first wave of customers, usually local men stopping by for drinks and conversation before heading home to their families. These early visitors were generally less trouble than the later crowd, but they also spent less money and required more effort to separate from their cash. The women worked in shifts, some focusing on the bar room, while others remained upstairs, ready to entertain customers who were willing to pay for more private attention. As the night wore on, the clientele grew rougher and more unpredictable. Cowboys who had been drinking since sundown became belligerent. Miners flush with gold dust became reckless with their spending, and tensions that had been simmering all day finally boiled over into violence. Kate maintained order through a combination of her own presence and the knowledge that serious troublemakers would find themselves banned from the establishment permanently. The late-night hours, from midnight until dawn, were often the most profitable, but also the most dangerous. This was when the truly desperate customers arrived, men who had lost their money gambling or drinking and were looking for credit or trying to negotiate alternative forms of payment. It was also when the violence was most likely to erupt as alcohol, testosterone, and exhaustion combined to create explosive situations. For the women, these late hours were a test of endurance and cunning. Exhaustion made it harder to read customers accurately, to spot trouble before it escalated, or to maintain the emotional armor that protected them from the worst aspects of their situation. Many turned to laudanum or other drugs to numb themselves to the reality of their circumstances, creating addictions that made escape from the life even more unlikely. Mary learned to navigate these treacherous late-night hours by developing an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it manifested. She could tell when a customer was about to turn violent, when a card game was about to explode into gunplay, or when Kate's patience with a particular troublemaker was reaching its limit. This skill kept her alive and relatively unharmed during her early months in the establishment. The relationship between the women in Kate's employ was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, they were competitors for customers and earnings, which created natural tensions and rivalries. On the other hand, they were the only people who truly understood the realities of each other's lives, which created bonds of solidarity and mutual protection that could be stronger than family ties. Older women in the establishment served as informal mentors to newcomers, teaching them the skills they needed to survive, while also establishing their own positions in the hierarchy. These relationships could be nurturing or exploitative, depending on the personalities involved and the circumstances of the moment. A veteran woman might take a newcomer under her wing, protecting her from the worst customers and teaching her valuable skills. But she might also expect loyalty, obedience, and a share of earnings in return. The women developed their own informal codes of conduct that governed interactions between them. Stealing customers was forbidden, as was informing on fellow workers to Kate or to law enforcement. Violence between women was generally discouraged, as it disrupted business and attracted unwanted attention, but verbal conflicts and psychological warfare were common. Mary found herself drawn into these complex relationships despite her initial intention to keep to herself. She formed alliances with women who could teach her valuable skills, while carefully avoiding those whose reputations suggested they might be dangerous or untrustworthy. She learned to navigate the subtle politics of the establishment, understanding who held real power beyond Kate's obvious authority and how to position herself advantageously within the group. One of Mary's earliest mentors was a woman known as Poker Alice, who had earned her nickname through her skill at cards and her ability to separate drunk customers from their money through games of chance. Alice had been in the life for nearly a decade and had developed a reputation for being both ruthless in business and fiercely protective of women she considered worthy of her attention. Alice taught Mary the finer points of reading customers, from identifying men who were likely to become violent to spotting those who might be carrying large amounts of money. She shared techniques for managing difficult situations, from diffusing potential fights to extracting herself from dangerous encounters. Most importantly, she taught Mary how to think like a businesswoman rather than a victim, to see customers as sources of income rather than threats to be endured. Under Alice's tutelage, Mary began to develop her own reputation within the establishment. She became known for her ability to handle difficult customers without creating scenes that might disrupt business. She learned to play poker well enough to supplement her income through gambling, and she developed a network of regular customers who paid premium prices for her time and attention. But Alice also taught Mary harder lessons about the realities of their world. She explained how diseases spread through establishments like Kate's, killing women slowly and painfully while they continued to work until they literally couldn't stand. She described the fate of women who aged out of the profession, reduced to cleaning and cooking for establishments that had once featured them as attractions. Most soberly, she shared stories of women who had tried to leave the life only to find themselves dragged back by circumstances, addiction, or violence. These lessons shaped Mary's understanding of her situation and her options for the future. She began to see that survival in this world required more than just enduring each day. It demanded strategic thinking, careful planning, and the accumulation of resources and connections that might eventually provide a path to something better. The medical realities of life in a frontier brothel were among its most brutal aspects. Disease was rampant, from common ailments like consumption and typhoid to the venereal diseases that were occupational hazards of the profession. Medical care was primitive when it existed at all, and women often suffered in silence rather than admit to illnesses that might prevent them from working. Kate maintained a rough-and-ready approach to medical care, keeping basic supplies on hand and calling in a doctor when absolutely necessary. But doctors in frontier towns were often as rough as their patients, and many refused to treat women from establishments like Kate's, viewing them as unworthy of medical attention or concern. Women learned to treat each other's ailments using folk remedies, patent medicines, and whatever medical knowledge they could acquire through experience. They shared information about which customers might be carrying diseases, and they developed their own methods for preventing and treating the infections that were constant threats to their health and livelihood. Mary learned these harsh lessons quickly, watching as women she had come to know and care about sickened and died from diseases that proper medical care might have prevented or cured. She saw how illness could destroy a woman's earning potential, reducing her to the most desperate circumstances as her health failed and her ability to attract customers diminished. The psychological toll of life in Kate's establishment was perhaps even more devastating than the physical dangers. Women were expected to maintain cheerful facades while enduring treatment that would have broken many men. They were required to show enthusiasm for encounters that disgusted them, to express affection for customers they despised, and to maintain hope for futures that seemed increasingly unlikely. Many women turned to alcohol or drugs to cope with the emotional strain of their circumstances. Laudanum was readily available and provided temporary escape from the realities of daily life, but it also created addictions that made escape from the profession even more difficult. Alcohol was even more accessible, and many women found themselves drinking to excess as a way of numbing themselves to their situations. Mary watched as women she had known as vibrant and hopeful gradually succumbed to despair, addiction, or madness. She saw how the constant performance of happiness and desire could eat away at a person's sense of self, leaving them unsure of who they really were beneath the masks they wore for customers. Yet she also witnessed remarkable displays of resilience and strength, as women found ways to maintain their humanity and dignity despite circumstances designed to strip both away. She saw women who used their positions to gather information that they could sell to interested parties, turning their apparent powerlessness into a form of influence. She met women who had managed to save money despite Kate's efforts to keep them dependent, and who were planning elaborate escapes to new lives in distant cities. These examples of female strength and cunning inspired Mary to begin developing her own long-term survival strategy. She started keeping careful track of her earnings and expenses, looking for ways to maximize her income while minimizing her dependence on Kate's establishment. She began cultivating relationships with customers who might prove useful in the future, not just as sources of immediate income, but as potential allies or sources of information. Most importantly, she began to study Kate herself, watching how the older woman had managed to rise from a position similar to Mary's own to become the undisputed ruler of her own domain. Kate's combination of ruthlessness, intelligence, and strategic thinking had allowed her to accumulate power in a world that typically denied women any agency at all. As months passed, and Mary's education in the realities of frontier brothel life continued, she began to see patterns in the chaos around her. She noticed which women thrived and which merely survived, which strategies led to advancement, and which led to destruction. She started to understand that success in this world required thinking several moves ahead, like a chess player anticipating her opponent's responses to every action. The seasonal rhythms of frontier life affected Kate's establishment in predictable ways. Spring brought cowboys heading north with cattle herds, their pockets full of advance pay and their spirits high with the promise of good weather and profitable drives. Summer saw miners returning from remote claims, some flush with gold, and others broke but optimistic about future prospects. Fall was harvest time for more than just farmers, as successful cattlemen and miners returned with the profits from their season's work. This was often the most profitable time for establishments like Kate's, as men with money competed for the attention of women who had been preparing all year for these boom periods. Winter was the hardest season, with travel difficult and money scarce. Many customers left for warmer climates or more promising territories, leaving the women to survive on reduced income while dealing with the additional expenses of heating and maintaining their quarters through the harsh frontier winters. Mary learned to plan for these seasonal fluctuations, saving money during profitable periods to carry her through the lean times. She watched which women managed to maintain their positions year after year and which disappeared during the winter months, never to return. She began to understand that longevity in this profession required not just surviving individual encounters with dangerous customers, but managing the long-term economics of a business that was inherently unstable. The legal environment surrounding establishments like Kate's was complex and constantly shifting. Officially, prostitution was illegal in most frontier territories, but enforcement was sporadic and often influenced by political considerations rather than moral ones. Local sheriffs and judges might tolerate or even protect brothels when they needed the tax revenue or political support, but crack down harshly when public pressure demanded action. Kate navigated this legal landscape through a combination of bribery, political connections, and careful attention to public sentiment. She made sure that her establishment contributed to local charities and civic improvements, positioning herself as a businesswoman rather than a criminal. She cultivated relationships with influential men who could protect her interests when legal troubles arose. The women in Kate's employ learned to be constantly alert for signs of changing political winds that might threaten their safety or livelihood. They developed networks of information that could provide advance warning of planned raids or crackdowns, allowing them to disappear temporarily or prepare for legal troubles. Mary understood that the precarious legal status of their profession meant that they could never rely on official protection or justice. When customers became violent or refused to pay, the women had to handle the situations themselves or rely on Kate's intervention. This created a parallel system of justice within the establishment, with its own rules, punishments, and forms of protection. The economic impact of establishments like Kate's on frontier communities was significant but rarely acknowledged officially. The money spent by customers supported not just the women and the establishment itself, but also local merchants, suppliers, and service providers. Brothels were often among the largest purchasers of food, alcohol, clothing, and other goods in frontier towns. Yet this economic contribution came with social costs that were borne primarily by the women themselves. They were excluded from respectable society, denied access to legitimate businesses and services, and treated as pariahs by the very communities that profited from their presence. Mary began to understand how this economic dynamic created a form of unofficial slavery, trapping women in the profession even when they desperately wanted to leave. The skills they developed in the brothel were not transferable to legitimate employment, and their reputations made it nearly impossible to establish new lives in the same communities where they had worked. This realization motivated Mary to begin thinking beyond mere survival toward actual escape. She started to study the few women who had managed to leave the profession successfully, trying to understand what strategies had worked and what mistakes had led to failure for others. As her first year in Kate's establishment drew to a close, Mary had transformed from a frightened farm girl into a hardened survivor who understood the brutal realities of frontier life. She had learned to read customers with uncanny accuracy, to navigate the complex social dynamics of the establishment, and to protect herself from the worst dangers of her profession. But she had also begun to formulate a plan for eventually leaving this world behind. She had identified potential allies, accumulated modest savings despite Kate's efforts to keep her women dependent, and developed skills that might prove useful in other contexts. Most importantly, she had learned to think strategically about her future, rather than simply enduring each day as it came. The lessons Mary learned during her time in Kate's establishment would serve her well in the years to come, as she gradually worked her way toward independence and eventual escape from the brutal world of the frontier brothel. Her story was one of survival, adaptation, and ultimate triumph over circumstances that had destroyed countless other women. Welcome back, my fellow night dwellers. Before we delve deeper into the shadows of the Wild West, I have a small favor to ask. In the comments below, let me know where in the world you're listening from and whether you're settling in for the night or finding a moment of calm in your day. If these explorations into forgotten corners of history bring you comfort, consider hitting that subscribe button so you never miss our journey into the past. Now, make yourself comfortable and let your mind wander with me to a world where survival meant more than just enduring another day. The dusty streets of Deadwood had grown familiar under Mary's feet, but familiarity bred neither comfort nor safety. 2 months had passed since Big Nose Kate had taken her under her wing, and Mary had learned that the hierarchy within these establishments was as rigid and unforgiving as any church doctrine she'd known back home. The women existed in a carefully constructed ecosystem of power, manipulation, and mutual dependence that would have been incomprehensible to the sheltered farm girl she'd once been. At the bottom were the newest arrivals, the broken birds like she had been, who commanded the lowest prices and endured the roughest treatment. These women often lasted mere weeks before disease, violence, or despair claimed them. Their rooms were little more than closets, their earnings barely enough to cover the inflated costs of room and board that the madams charged. Many were trapped in cycles of debt that seemed designed never to be repaid. Each meal, each dress, each bottle of laudanum adding to their burden. Above them were the working girls who had survived their first year, women who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of their profession with cunning and resilience. They had developed their own methods of protection, forming alliances with particular customers, learning which men to avoid, and mastering the delicate art of appearing enthusiastic while remaining emotionally detached. These women commanded better prices and slightly better treatment, but they lived with the constant knowledge that their position was precarious, dependent on their looks, their health, and their ability to please increasingly jaded clientele. At the apex stood the madames themselves, women like Big Nose Kate, who had clawed their way to the top through a combination of business acumen, ruthlessness, and sheer survival instinct. These women controlled everything, from which girls worked, which nights, to who received protection, and who was left to fend for themselves. They were entrepreneurs in a world that offered women few legitimate business opportunities, but their success came at a cost that could be measured in the broken lives of the women beneath them. Mary watched this hierarchy play out daily in the small interactions between the women. She observed how Sarah, one of the more established girls, would claim the best mirror in the shared dressing room without challenge, how the newer arrivals instinctively deferred to her judgment about which customers to avoid. She noticed how conversations would stop when Big Nose Kate entered a room, how even the most rebellious spirits would lower their eyes and moderate their voices in her presence. The economics of their world were brutal and transparent. Each woman was expected to entertain a certain number of customers per night, with the house taking its substantial cut from every transaction. The madames provided room, board, clothing, and protection, but at prices that ensured most women remained perpetually in debt. A dress that might cost $2 in a legitimate shop would be charged at $10 to a working girl, with the justification that it was specially fitted and appropriate for her profession. Meals were similarly inflated, and any special requests, whether for better food, laudanum for pain, or a night off due to illness, came with additional charges. Mary learned to navigate this system with the same careful attention she had once applied to avoiding her father's drunken rages. She kept meticulous mental records of her earnings and expenses, searching for any opportunity to accumulate even a small surplus. She learned which customers tipped generously and which were likely to become violent, which girls could be trusted with confidences and which would sell information to the madames for favour or protection. The violence was omnipresent but often subtle. A customer who became too rough would be handled by the house's enforcers, but not before the woman had endured whatever he chose to inflict. The threat of being turned out onto the streets was wielded like a weapon by the madams, who knew that most of their girls had nowhere else to go. Even the protection they offered came with strings attached, creating a web of obligation and dependency that was nearly impossible to escape. Disease was another constant spectre haunting their daily lives. The primitive medical understanding of the time meant that sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly and were often fatal. Women would disappear from the house with little explanation, sometimes dying in agony in charity hospitals, sometimes simply vanishing into the night when they became too ill to work. The madames showed little sentimentality about such losses, quickly replacing the deceased with fresh arrivals who were often unaware of their predecessor's fate. Mary had witnessed 3 such disappearances in her short time at the establishment. First was Agnes, a sweet-faced girl from Ohio who had arrived the same week as Mary. Agnes had developed a persistent cough that grew worse each day, accompanied by a fever that left her delirious and unable to work. The second was Dolores, a Mexican woman who had been popular with the customers due to her exotic appearance and gentle manner. Dolores had begun experiencing severe abdominal pain and bleeding that left her unable to stand for long periods. When she became too ill to entertain customers, Kate had her quietly removed from the house under cover of darkness. Mary never learned what became of her, but the speed and secrecy of her departure suggested that Kate had little intention of paying for medical care that might not restore Dolores to working condition. The third disappearance had been the most disturbing. Rebecca, a woman in her late 20s who had worked in the house for several years, had developed what appeared to be syphilis. The telltale rash and sores made her unmarketable, and her increasingly erratic behavior as the disease progressed made her a liability. One evening, Rebecca simply wasn't there anymore. Her room reassigned to a new girl before anyone had time to ask questions. These losses served as stark reminders to the surviving women of their own vulnerability and expendability. They understood that their value was entirely dependent on their ability to generate income, and that illness, injury, or age would likely result in swift abandonment. This knowledge created an atmosphere of desperate competition mixed with grudging solidarity, as women simultaneously competed for the best customers while forming alliances for mutual protection. Mary learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a woman was losing favor with the madams. A gradual reduction in the quality of assigned customers, relegation to less desirable time slots, or exclusion from the better rooms were all harbingers of eventual dismissal. She watched as women who had once held positions of relative privilege slowly slipped down the hierarchy, their desperation growing more palpable with each passing day. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. Many women turned to alcohol or laudanum to numb themselves to their reality, but these substances came at premium prices that further deepened their debt. Others developed elaborate fantasy lives, creating stories about wealthy customers who would rescue them or family members who would eventually come to take them away. Some simply retreated into themselves, becoming hollow-eyed automatons who went through the motions of their profession while their spirits slowly died. Mary fought against this psychological erosion by maintaining her plans for escape. She continued to save every penny she could, hiding her small accumulation of coins in a tin sewn into the lining of her coat. She studied the rhythms of the house, noting when guards were changed, when the madames were distracted, and when opportunities for freedom might arise. She cultivated relationships with customers who seemed less dangerous, hoping to identify potential allies or sources of information about the outside world. But she also understood that escape would require more than just money and opportunity. She would need a destination, a plan for supporting herself once she left, and the courage to leave behind the only stability, however brutal, that she had known since her arrival in Deadwood. The world beyond the brothel was largely unknown to her, and the stories she heard from customers painted it as potentially even more dangerous for a woman alone. The other women in the house represented both cautionary tales and sources of inspiration. Sarah, the established girl who commanded respect, had been working in such establishments for over 5 years. She had accumulated enough money to dress well and eat regularly, but Mary could see the toll that time had taken on her. Sarah's eyes held a hardness that spoke of experiences too terrible to share, and her practiced smile never quite reached those eyes. She had achieved a kind of success within the system, but at the cost of her youth and innocence. In contrast, there was Lily, a girl barely older than Mary, who had arrived from San Francisco with stories of houses where the women were treated better, earned more money, and had more control over their circumstances. Lily's tales painted a picture of a more civilized version of their profession, where madames acted more like business partners than slave masters, and where women could eventually buy their way to independence. Whether these stories were true or simply comforting fantasies, they provided hope to the other women, and served as a reminder that their current situation, however it seemed permanent, was not necessarily their final destination. Mary found herself caught between Sarah's pragmatic acceptance and Lily's optimistic dreams. She understood the necessity of adapting to her current circumstances while maintaining hope for something better. This balance required a careful management of her emotional resources, allowing herself to feel enough to remain human while protecting herself from the full impact of her daily reality. The customers themselves represented a cross-section of frontier society. each bringing their own particular dangers and opportunities. There were the cowboys, often young and inexperienced, who might be rough due to nervousness or alcohol, but were generally less threatening than older, more hardened men. These boys sometimes carried letters from home, or stories of distant places that provided brief escapes from the confines of the house. The miners were a different breed entirely, men who had spent months in isolation and deprivation, often emerging from their claims with pockets full of gold dust and desperate hungers that went beyond the physical. Some were generous in their loneliness, paying extra for conversation and companionship as much as for physical gratification. Others were bitter and angry, taking out their frustrations about failed claims and broken dreams on the women who served them. Perhaps most dangerous were the businessmen and professionals, men who possessed both wealth and social standing and felt entitled to whatever they desired. These customers often demanded services that the women found particularly degrading or dangerous, using their economic power to coerce compliance. They were also the most likely to become possessive or obsessive, creating situations that could escalate into violence if their desires were not perfectly satisfied. Mary learned to categorize customers quickly, developing an instinct for danger that had kept her relatively safe during her time in the house. She knew which men to encourage with smiles and conversation, and which to serve efficiently and quickly to minimize her exposure to their potential violence. She learned the value of appearing eager while maintaining emotional distance, of seeming available while protecting her inner self from complete violation. The seasonal rhythms of Deadwood affected the brothel's business significantly. Winter brought fewer customers, but those who came often stayed longer, seeking warmth and human contact during the isolated months. Spring brought an influx of new miners and fortune seekers, men with fresh hopes and full pockets who were often the most generous customers. Summer was the busiest season, with the town swelling to several times its winter population as prospectors, cowboys, and opportunists flooded in from across the territory. Each season brought its own challenges and opportunities. Winter's reduced business meant that competition between the women intensified, while the confined quarters led to increased tensions and conflicts. Spring's new arrivals included fresh-faced girls who threatened the positions of more established women, leading to a complex dynamic of mentorship and rivalry. Summer's chaos provided both the highest earnings and the greatest dangers, as the influx of strangers made violence more unpredictable and law enforcement more strained. Mary had experienced only one full seasonal cycle, but she could already see how these rhythms affected not just the business, but the psychological state of everyone in the house. The madames became more demanding during busy periods, pushing the women to entertain more customers and work longer hours. During slower periods, they became more controlling, using the reduced income as justification for tighter restrictions and harsher treatment. Through all of this, Mary continued to evolve, shedding layers of her former identity while constructing a new self capable of surviving in this harsh environment. The frightened farm girl who had arrived in Deadwood was being replaced by someone harder, more calculating, and infinitely more resilient. This transformation was both necessary for survival and a source of private grief, as she mourned the innocence and trust that she had been forced to abandon. Yet even as she adapted to her circumstances, Mary never lost sight of her ultimate goal: escape. She understood that survival was not enough. She needed to find a way to reclaim control over her own destiny. This meant not just accumulating money, but developing the skills and knowledge she would need to navigate the world beyond the brothel's walls. Every conversation with a customer was an opportunity to learn about the outside world. Every interaction with other women, a chance to gather information about alternative paths to independence. The women who had achieved some measure of success within the system served as both inspiration and warning. They had proven that it was possible to rise within the hierarchy, to accumulate wealth and influence even within the confines of their profession. But they had also demonstrated the costs of such success, the hardening of spirit, and the acceptance of a life that, however comfortable, remained fundamentally constrained by the desires and demands of others. As winter began to settle over Deadwood once again, Mary reflected on how much she had changed in the months since her arrival. The naive girl who had been overwhelmed by her first encounter with Big Nose Kate was gone, replaced by someone who could navigate the complex social dynamics of the brothel, manage dangerous customers, and accumulate the resources necessary for eventual escape. She had learned to survive, but more importantly, she had learned to plan. The transformation had come at a price that she was only beginning to understand. The easy trust and open affection that had characterized her relationships with her family, despite their poverty and hardships, had been replaced by a careful calculation of advantage and risk in every human interaction. The faith in basic human goodness that had sustained her through her journey west had been eroded by daily exposure to the worst aspects of human nature. The dreams of romantic love and happy families that had filled her girlhood fantasies had been replaced by more pragmatic hopes for financial security and personal autonomy. Yet Mary refused to see these changes as entirely negative. The skills she had developed, the knowledge she had gained, and the resilience she had built would serve her well regardless of what path her life eventually took. She had learned to read people quickly and accurately, to manage her emotions under extreme stress, and to find opportunity even in the most adverse circumstances. These were valuable abilities that many women of her era never had the chance to develop. As she prepared for sleep in her small room, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, Mary allowed herself a moment of pride in her survival. She had endured experiences that would have broken many people, yet she remained determined to build a better future for herself. The money hidden in her coat lining was growing slowly but steadily, and with it, her options for eventual freedom. The path ahead remained uncertain and dangerous, but Mary had learned that uncertainty could be navigated with careful planning, and that danger could be managed with knowledge and preparation. She had discovered reserves of strength and cunning that she had never known she possessed, and these discoveries gave her confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would find a way to meet them. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the Silver Dollar Saloon as Mary Catherine Sullivan swept the warped wooden floors, her movements mechanical after months of routine. But beneath her practiced composure, her mind was calculating, always calculating. The lessons Big Nose Kate had drilled into her were becoming second nature now, transforming her from the naive farm girl who'd first stumbled through these doors into something altogether more formidable. The hierarchy of the establishment had crystallized around Mary with brutal clarity. At the bottom were the desperate women who'd drift in for a few weeks before disappearing into the night, sometimes by choice, often not. Above them were the regulars, like herself, women who'd found their footing and learned to navigate the treacherous currents of frontier vice. And at the top sat Kate, iron-fisted and sharp-eyed, orchestrating the delicate dance between survival and destruction that defined their world. Mary had watched enough women come and go to understand the unforgiving mathematics of their profession. The laudanum girls, hollow-eyed and trembling, rarely lasted more than a season before their bodies gave out or their minds snapped entirely. The drinkers who tried to numb themselves with rot-gut whiskey found their judgment clouded at precisely the moments when sharp wits meant the difference between life and death. Those who surrendered to despair simply vanished one day, leaving behind only whispered rumors and hastily abandoned belongings. But there was another category, the survivors. These were the women who'd learned to compartmentalize their emotions, to treat each interaction as a strategic engagement rather than a personal violation. They were the ones who squirreled away coins in hidden caches, who cultivated relationships with the more reliable customers, who understood that information could be as valuable as currency in the lawless frontier economy. Mary was becoming one of them, and the transformation both thrilled and terrified her. Her education in the brutal realities of frontier commerce had accelerated rapidly under Kate's tutelage. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished a paying customer from a potential threat. The way a man's eyes moved when he entered the saloon, the tension in his shoulders, the condition of his clothes and weapons. Cowboys flush with cattle drive money carried themselves differently than desperate prospectors clutching their last few dollars. Traveling salesmen had their own particular mannerisms, as did the gamblers who drifted from town to town like human tumbleweeds. Each category required a different approach, a different performance. The lonely cowboys wanted the illusion of romance, of being desired rather than merely tolerated. The rough miners needed to feel powerful, to believe they were conquering rather than purchasing. The businessmen craved sophistication, the fantasy that they were dealing with a lady of refinement rather than a frontier prostitute. Mary had become adept at shifting between these personas, donning and discarding personalities like costumes in a traveling theatre troupe. The physical demands of the work had hardened her body as surely as the emotional demands had armored her soul. The endless hours on her feet, the poor nutrition, the constant stress, all of it had carved away the soft curves of her farm girl youth, leaving behind a lean, wiry frame that spoke of endurance rather than comfort. Her hands, once smooth from milking cows and churning butter, now bore the calluses and small scars of her new profession. But it was the mental transformation that proved most profound. Mary found herself developing an almost supernatural ability to assess and manipulate the men who sought her services. She could spot a violent drunk from across a crowded room, identify the customers who might prove generous with tips, and recognize the dangerous ones who viewed women as objects to be broken rather than people to be purchased. Kate had taught her that survival in their world depended on maintaining multiple identities simultaneously. There was the public face, the sultry, available woman who drew customers like moths to a flame. There was the private self, carefully guarded and revealed to no one. And there was the calculating observer who watched every interaction for advantage, who hoarded information and resources against an uncertain future. The other women in the establishment provided a constant reminder of the stakes involved in this delicate balancing act. Sarah, a former schoolteacher from back east, had arrived at the Silver Dollar with dreams of earning enough money to start over somewhere respectable. Instead, she'd fallen prey to the laudanum dealers who preyed on women trying to escape their circumstances. Now she moved through her days in an opium-dulled haze, her once sharp mind reduced to a collection of half-formed thoughts and desperate cravings. Then there was Molly, barely 16, and already bearing the marks of violence that were all too common in their profession. A customer had beaten her severely the previous month, leaving her with a permanent limp and a flinch that appeared whenever a man raised his voice. Kate had taken care of the perpetrator in her own efficient way. He'd been found face down in the creek the next morning, but the damage to Molly was irreversible. These cautionary tales served as constant reminders to Mary of the precipice on which they all balanced. One moment of carelessness, one customer misread, one night when exhaustion overcame vigilance. Any of these could spell disaster in a world where women like them were considered barely a step above livestock. Yet even in this harsh environment, Mary had begun to identify opportunities that extended beyond the immediate transaction of her body for money. The saloon served as an unofficial information exchange for the entire territory, and she'd learned to listen carefully to the conversations that swirled around the bar. Cattle prices, mining claims, railroad expansion plans, territorial politics. All of it passed through the silver dollar like water through a sieve, and Mary had developed an ear for the details that might prove profitable. She'd also begun to cultivate relationships with some of the more established businessmen who frequented the establishment. These weren't the rough cowboys or desperate miners, but the merchants and bankers and land speculators who formed the nascent power structure of the growing frontier economy. They appreciated her intelligence and discretion, and several had begun to seek her out, not just for physical companionship, but for conversation and counsel. It was a dangerous game, this cultivation of influence among the town's elite. The other women watched her with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, recognizing that she was playing by different rules than the simple exchange of services for payment that governed most of their interactions. Kate, too, had taken notice, though her approval came with its own set of complications. The madam had begun to involve Mary in the more complex aspects of running the establishment, keeping track of the house's finances, negotiating with suppliers, managing the relationships with local law enforcement that kept them operating despite the territory's official moral stance. It was education of a sort that no finishing school could have provided, a masterclass in the intersection of business and survival in a world where both operated outside the boundaries of conventional society. But perhaps the most valuable lesson Mary learned was the importance of maintaining hope while preparing for the worst. She watched women who surrendered to despair simply waste away, their spirits broken by the relentless degradation of their circumstances. She also observed those who clung to unrealistic fantasies of rescue or redemption, only to have their dreams shattered against the harsh realities of frontier life. The key, she realized, was to maintain a clear-eyed assessment of her situation while never abandoning the possibility of something better. Every coin she saved, every skill she acquired, every relationship she carefully cultivated, all of it was insurance against an uncertain future. She wasn't just surviving, she was positioning herself for whatever opportunities might arise in the rapidly changing landscape of the American frontier. The transformation of Mary Catherine Sullivan from farm girl to frontier survivor was nearly complete, but it had come at a cost that extended far beyond the obvious physical and emotional toll. She could feel pieces of her former self slipping away like sand through her fingers, the easy laughter, the unguarded trust, the simple pleasure she'd once taken in small kindnesses. In their place had grown something harder and more calculating, a personality forged in the crucible of necessity and tempered by daily exposure to humanity's darker impulses. As she finished her morning cleaning and prepared for another day of performance and calculation, Mary caught a glimpse of herself in the saloon's cracked mirror. The face that stared back was still recognizably hers, but the eyes held depths that would have been foreign to the girl who'd left her family's farm what felt like a lifetime ago. They were the eyes of a survivor, of someone who'd learned to navigate a world where weakness was punished swiftly and without mercy. The morning customers would begin arriving soon, and with them would come the familiar dance of assessment and adaptation that now defined her existence. Mary gritted her teeth as another wave of drunken laughter erupted from the Broken Wheel Saloon. 3 months had passed since she'd first stepped through those swinging doors, and the naive farm girl who'd believed tales of easy money and respectable work was long dead. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, carved from necessity and survival in this brutal frontier outpost where women like her occupied the bottom rung of an already merciless hierarchy. The establishment operated with clockwork precision under Big Nose Kate's iron fist. Every morning brought the same ritual: inspection, assignments, and the cold calculation of flesh as commodity. Kate's weathered face bore the map of decades in this business, her eyes holding the kind of hardness that came from making impossible choices again and again. She'd survived by being smarter, meaner, and more ruthless than anyone else, and she demanded that same cunning from her girls. You learn fast or you don't last. Kate had told Mary on that first terrifying night. Mary learned to read the subtle signs that meant survival. The way a man's hand moved toward his gun belt. The particular glassy look in a miner's eyes that meant he'd crossed from drunk to dangerous. The sound of boots on stairs that could signal either easy money or serious trouble. Each lesson was paid for in bruises, humiliation, or worse. The social structure within the brothel was as rigid as any military unit. At the top sat Kate, her word absolute law. Below her were the established girls who'd earned their status through longevity and Kate's favour. These women guarded their positions jealously, seeing newcomers like Mary as threats to their already precarious security. They'd help you learn the ropes only after you'd proven you weren't competition for their regular customers. Then came the middle tier, women who'd found their place in this world, but hadn't yet secured Kate's inner circle. They moved through their days with practiced efficiency, their faces masks that revealed nothing of the calculations running constantly beneath. They knew which customers tipped well, which ones got violent when drunk, and which lawmen could be bought or threatened. At the bottom were girls like Mary had been, fresh arrivals still clinging to whatever delusions had brought them west. They learned quickly that tears were a luxury they couldn't afford, that showing weakness invited predators, and that survival meant becoming someone their former selves wouldn't recognize. The clientele fell into their own brutal categories. There were the miners, fresh from weeks underground, their pockets heavy with gold dust and their eyes wild with the kind of desperation that came from too much isolation and too little human contact. They'd spend everything in a single night, buying not just flesh, but the illusion of connection, of being wanted rather than merely tolerated. The cowboys posed different challenges. Sun-weathered and hard as the cattle they drove, they carried themselves with the swagger of men who lived by violence. They expected deference, submission, and they had little patience for anything less. A smart girl learned to read the brand on their chaps, to know which outfits had reputations for treating women like livestock. Then there were the businessmen, clean-shaven and soft-handed, who carried themselves with the arrogance of education and money. They were often the worst, hiding their cruelty behind silk vests and proper grammar. They'd demand things that left marks where clothing would hide them, and they'd smile while they did it. The seasonal rhythm of the frontier town dictated everything. Spring brought trail drives and optimism, men with fresh hopes and winter savings burning holes in their pockets. Summer meant long days and longer nights, the heat making tempers short and violence quick. Fall carried the desperation of men preparing for another harsh winter, either celebrating good fortune or drowning sorrows in whatever comfort they could buy. Winter was the hardest time. Business slowed to a trickle as the town battened down against the cold. The girls competed more fiercely for fewer customers, and Kate's mood grew darker with each day of reduced profits. Food ran low, coal was expensive, and the thin walls of the cribs offered little protection against the howling wind that swept down from the mountains. Mary learned to navigate this world through careful observation and calculated risk. She studied the other women, noting which strategies kept them safe and which led to broken bones or worse. She watched Kate's moods like a barometer, understanding that the madam's favour could mean the difference between a warm room and sleeping in the stable. The law in Deadwood existed at the whim of whoever held the most power on any given day. Sheriff Bullock tried to maintain order, but his authority ended where the money of the mining companies and cattle barons began. For women in Mary's position, justice was whatever they could negotiate or enforce themselves. Some girls carried derringers in their garters. Others relied on alliances with particular customers who'd protect them in exchange for loyalty. The smartest ones, like Kate herself, accumulated information and used it as currency. knowledge of who owed money to whom, which wives suspected their husbands' activities, and which prominent citizens had tastes they'd pay to keep secret. This was power in a world where conventional law offered no protection. Disease was a constant spectre, haunting every interaction. The frontier had little understanding of prevention and even less in the way of treatment. Girls who fell ill often faced a choice between working sick or not eating. The lucky ones might find a customer willing to pay for their care, but such arrangements came with their own prices. Mary had seen strong women waste away from ailments that proper medicine might have cured. She'd held the hands of girls younger than herself as they died from complications that would have been minor inconveniences in more civilized places. Each death served as a reminder of how precarious their existence truly was. The psychological toll extracted its own price. Mary learned to split herself into pieces. The part that smiled and played her role, and the part that retreated somewhere safe inside her mind. She developed the ability to be present, but not present, to participate while remaining fundamentally untouched by the transactions that defined her days. This dissociation was both survival mechanism and slow poison. It allowed her to endure what would have broken her completely, but it also eroded her connection to her own emotions, her own sense of self. She watched other women lose themselves entirely to this protective numbness, becoming hollow-eyed automatons who went through the motions of living without any spark of the people they'd once been. Yet somehow, in quiet moments between customers, or during the brief respite of early morning hours, Mary found herself planning. Not just for survival, but for escape. She hoarded coins with the dedication of a miser, hiding them in places Kate wouldn't think to look. She listened to conversations about other towns, other opportunities, other lives that might be possible for someone clever enough to seize them. The frontier was changing, even in the short time she'd been there. The railroad was coming, bringing with it a different kind of civilization. Towns that had existed as rough camps were becoming more permanent settlements, with families and churches, and the kinds of social structures that had no place for establishments like the broken wheel. Mary knew that change would eventually come to Deadwood too. The question was whether she'd still be there when it arrived, or whether she'd have found the courage and the means to write her own ending to this brutal chapter of her life. The life of Mary Sullivan. From desperation to power. Behind the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, where the whiskey flowed and the piano played till dawn, a woman's life hung in the balance. Mary Sullivan pressed her back against the cold wall of the upstairs hallway, listening to the heavy boots of angry miners thundering up the wooden stairs. 3 weeks into her new existence in this frontier town, she already knew the rules were written in blood and broken promises. The sound of a bottle shattering against the doorframe sent ice through her veins. She had miscalculated. The man downstairs had wanted more than just her company for the evening, and when she'd refused his increasingly violent demands, his rage had erupted like a powder keg. Now she could hear him bellowing her name, his voice thick with whiskey and fury, promising consequences that made her stomach turn. Mary's trembling fingers found the small derringer hidden in the folds of her dress. Big nose. Kate had given it to her on her first day, along with a piece of advice that now rang in her ears like a death knell. Out here, honey, you're either the hunter or the prey. This was the brutal reality that awaited women in the frontier saloons of the American West. Far from the romanticized tales of dance hall girls with hearts of gold, these establishments were pressure cookers of violence, exploitation, and desperation, where survival demanded a particular kind of cunning that most people could never imagine. The hierarchy within these saloons was as rigid as it was ruthless. At the bottom were the percentage girls, young women barely out of their teens who earned their keep by convincing patrons to buy overpriced drinks. They received a small commission on each sale, often just enough to cover their room and board with little left over. These girls were the most vulnerable, frequently preyed upon by both customers and the more established women who saw them as competition for the limited resources available. Above them stood the hurdy-gurdy girls, who danced with customers for a fee and sometimes provided additional services. They had slightly more autonomy than the percentage girls, but remained under the watchful eye of the saloon's management. The dance floor was their domain, but it was also their battlefield, where they had to navigate the wandering hands and crude propositions of men who had been drinking all day. At the top of this precarious social ladder were the madames like Big Nose Kate, women who had clawed their way to positions of relative power through a combination of shrewd business sense, strategic alliances, and sheer force of will. These women controlled the other girls' schedules, negotiated with troublesome customers, and maintained the delicate balance between profit and survival that kept the establishment running. Kate herself was a legend in the territory, a woman whose very presence could silence a rowdy crowd or broker peace between feuding factions. Born Catherine Elder in Hungary, she had immigrated to America as a child and learned early that a woman alone had to create her own opportunities. By the time she reached the frontier, she had already buried one husband and survived 2 attempts on her life by men who thought they could take what she had built. The morning after Mary's confrontation, Kate found her sitting in the empty saloon, cleaning her derringer with methodical precision. The miner who had threatened her lay unconscious in the alley behind the building, sporting a magnificent black eye and a split lip courtesy of Kate's brass knuckles. "You did good last night," Kate said, settling her considerable bulk into a chair across from Mary. "But next time, don't wait for them to corner you." Mary looked up from her weapon, noting the approval in Kate's steel-grey eyes. Kate's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Honey, they're all violent." This conversation marked the beginning of Mary's education in the brutal economics of frontier survival. Under Kate's tutelage, she learned to read the subtle signs that separated merely drunk customers from genuinely dangerous ones. She discovered how to establish dominance without appearing threatening, how to extract information that could be used as leverage, and most importantly, how to build a network of allies who could provide protection when things went wrong. The clientele that frequented these establishments represented every stratum of frontier society, each group bringing its own particular dangers and opportunities. The miners were perhaps the most unpredictable, men who spent months in isolation before descending on the town with pockets full of gold dust and hearts full of loneliness. Some were gentle souls, grateful for any human contact, while others carried the accumulated rage of their harsh existence like a loaded weapon. Cowboys presented a different challenge entirely. These men lived by a code that valued toughness above all else, and they often saw the women in the saloons as conquests to be claimed, rather than people to be respected. Yet they also possessed a strange chivalry that could be exploited by women clever enough to appeal to their sense of honor and protection. The most dangerous customers were often the businessmen and politicians who visited the saloons after conducting their legitimate affairs in town. These men had reputations to protect and resources to deploy, making them capable of extraordinary cruelty when they felt their secrets might be exposed. They were also the most valuable clients, as they could afford to pay premium prices for discretion and specialized services. Mary quickly learned that information was as valuable as gold in these establishments. A careless word about a business deal, a slip about a family scandal, or details about a competitor's plans could be turned into currency with the right buyer. The women in the saloons became inadvertent intelligence brokers, collecting secrets as naturally as they collected coins. The physical dangers were only part of the challenge. Disease ran rampant in these frontier communities, with little understanding of sanitation or medical care available. Cholera, typhoid, and consumption could sweep through a saloon in a matter of days, leaving behind empty rooms and unpaid debts. Venereal diseases were an occupational hazard that many women faced with resignation rather than hope for treatment. Pregnancy represented another form of catastrophe. Without reliable contraception or safe medical procedures, an unwanted pregnancy could end a woman's career and leave her destitute. Some women turned to dangerous home remedies or sought out the services of questionable practitioners, risking their lives for a chance to maintain their independence. The psychological toll was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. These women lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, never able to fully relax or trust that tomorrow would bring anything other than new threats and challenges. Many turned to alcohol or laudanum to numb the emotional pain, creating addictions that further compromised their ability to protect themselves. Yet within this harsh environment, genuine friendships and support networks emerged. Women like Mary learned to watch out for each other, sharing information about dangerous customers, lending money during hard times, and providing comfort when the weight of their circumstances became overwhelming. These bonds often prove stronger than family ties, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. Mary's relationship with Kate evolved from simple mentorship to something approaching mother and daughter. Kate saw in Mary a reflection of her younger self, someone with the intelligence and determination necessary to not just survive, but thrive in this unforgiving world. Mary, in turn, recognized that Kate's harsh lessons were acts of love, attempts to prepare her for battles that would inevitably come. As months passed, Mary began to develop her own reputation within the community. She learned to negotiate better terms for her services, to cultivate relationships with influential customers, and to build a small reserve of savings that could provide security in an uncertain world. More importantly, she learned to project an aura of competence and control that discouraged most men from testing her limits. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The frightened young woman who had pressed herself against the wall in terror had evolved into someone who could command respect through presence alone. She still carried the derringer, but now it felt less like a desperate last resort and more like a tool of the trade, no different from a carpenter's hammer or a blacksmith's tongs. This evolution reflected the broader reality of women's lives in the frontier West. Stripped of the traditional support systems that existed in more established communities, they were forced to develop new strategies for survival and advancement. Some, like Mary, found ways to turn their circumstances to their advantage, using the very dangers that threatened them as stepping stones to greater independence and power. The frontier saloon, for all its brutality and exploitation, also represented a strange form of liberation. Here, a woman's worth was determined by her wit, courage, and business acumen rather than her family connections or social standing. Success required a particular kind of intelligence that combined street smarts with emotional resilience, and those who possessed these qualities could rise to positions that would have been unthinkable in more conventional settings. The relationship between these women and the law was complex and often contradictory. While their profession existed in a legal grey area, many found themselves serving as informal mediators in disputes, sources of information for law enforcement, and even protectors of community peace. Their intimate knowledge of the town's residents and their motivations made them valuable allies for sheriffs and judges who understood the realities of frontier justice. Mary's growing influence within the saloon community eventually attracted the attention of outside business interests. Land speculators, railroad executives, and territorial politicians recognized that women like her possessed valuable insights into local conditions and could serve as conduits for information and influence. These relationships required delicate navigation, as the benefits they offered came with their own risks and obligations. The economic realities of frontier life meant that traditional gender roles often bent under the pressure of survival. Women who might have spent their lives as wives and mothers in more settled areas found themselves running businesses, making investment decisions, and wielding political influence in ways that challenged conventional expectations. The saloon became not just a place of entertainment, but a crucial node in the informal networks that actually governed frontier communities. As Mary's story demonstrates, the brutal life of a Wild West saloon woman was not simply a tale of victimization and despair. While the dangers were real and the costs often devastating, these women also developed remarkable resilience and found ways to carve out spaces of agency and power within systems designed to exploit them. Their experiences offer a complex and often overlooked perspective on the American frontier, revealing the courage and ingenuity required to survive in one of history's most challenging environments. The legacy of women like Mary Sullivan and Big Nose Kate extends far beyond the dusty streets of frontier boomtowns. Their stories illuminate the broader themes of adaptation, survival, and the pursuit of independence that defined the American West. The months stretched on in Tombstone, each one carving deeper lines into Mary's face and harder edges into her soul. Winter brought its own special miseries to the frontier saloon world. The snow piled high against the wooden buildings, trapping everyone inside for weeks at a time. The air grew thick with tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and the stench of desperation that seemed to seep from the very walls. Mary had learned to navigate the treacherous social currents of Big Nose Kate's establishment with the skill of a riverboat captain reading dangerous waters. She understood now that survival meant more than just enduring the physical brutality. It meant mastering the psychological warfare that played out every single day between the women, the customers, and Kate herself. The hierarchy among the girls was as rigid as any military structure and just as unforgiving. At the bottom were the fresh arrivals, the ones who still flinched at rough touch and whose eyes hadn't yet gone dead. These girls were fair game for everyone. The customers treated them like broken toys. The other women saw them as competition to be eliminated, and Kate viewed them as disposable assets to be used up and discarded. Mary had clawed her way up from that lowest rung through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and sheer stubborn refusal to break. She'd learned to read men like open books, to spot the difference between a cowboy with money burning a hole in his pocket and a drifter who'd kill you for the coins in your mattress. She could smell violence on a man's breath before he even knew he was angry. And she'd developed an arsenal of techniques for diffusing dangerous situations, or when necessary, making sure someone else took the beating instead of her. The other women had grudgingly accepted her into their ranks, recognizing in Mary the same hardened pragmatism that had allowed them to survive. There was Sarah, a former preacher's daughter from Ohio, who'd been sold to a traveling brothel by her own father to pay his gambling debts. She'd perfected the art of playing innocent and vulnerable while picking her customers' pockets clean. Then there was Carmen, a fiery Mexican woman who'd fled across the border after killing her husband's mistress with a kitchen knife. She specialized in the rougher trade, the men who wanted their pleasure mixed with pain. And there was Rebecca, the oldest of Kate's girls at 28, who'd been working saloons since she was 14. Rebecca had seen it all, the boom towns that sprouted overnight and died just as fast, the mining camps where men went months without seeing a woman, the cattle drives where cowboys would spend their entire season's wages in a single night of debauchery. She'd survived by being smarter than everyone else, saving every penny she could, and planning for the day when her looks would no longer be enough to keep her alive. These women formed an uneasy alliance, bound together by their shared degradation and their mutual understanding that any one of them could be dead by morning. They shared information about dangerous customers, pooled resources when one of them was sick or injured, and maintained a code of silence that protected them all from Kate's wrath. But the competition was fierce and sometimes deadly. When a new girl arrived who was prettier, younger, or more skilled at separating men from their money, the established women would close ranks to destroy her. They'd spread rumors about diseases, steal her customers, or simply arrange for her to find herself alone with the wrong man at the wrong time. Mary had participated in this vicious culling process. telling herself it was necessary for survival. But each act of betrayal carved away another piece of her humanity. The customers themselves represented every variety of frontier brutality. There were the miners, their hands permanently stained black with coal dust, and their lungs already showing the telltale signs of the slow death that awaited them underground. They came to the saloon to forget the crushing darkness of the mines, to pretend for a few hours that they were more than just disposable labor in the grand machine of Western expansion. The cowboys were different, lean, hard men who'd spent months on the trail with nothing but cattle and each other for company. They arrived in town like a storm front, wild with pent-up energy and desperate for any kind of human connection. Some were gentle, almost childlike in their loneliness. Others were twisted by isolation and violence, treating the saloon girls like objects to be used and discarded. Then there were the gamblers, the confidence men, the snake oil salesmen, predators who preyed on the dreams and desperation of everyone else. These men were often the most dangerous because they were the most calculating. They understood that violence was just another tool to be used when charm and manipulation failed. And scattered among them were the truly broken ones, men who'd lost everything to war, disease, or simple bad luck. These customers were unpredictable, swinging between maudlin sentimentality and explosive rage without warning. Mary had learned to spot the telltale signs, the thousand-yard stare of the shell-shocked veteran, the trembling hands of the opium addict, the hollow laugh of the man who'd buried his entire family. The physical toll of this life was relentless and cumulative. Mary's body bore the evidence of countless encounters, scars from knives and broken bottles, bruises in various stages of healing, the permanent ache in her back from too many nights spent in uncomfortable positions. She'd lost 2 teeth to a drunken cowboy's fist and had learned to smile with her mouth closed. Her hands, once soft and white, were now calloused and marked with small burns from cigars and pipes. But it was the diseases that truly terrified all the women. Syphilis was rampant in the saloon trade, and Mary had watched girl after girl succumb to its ravages. First the sores, then the madness, finally the slow, agonizing death. There was no cure, no treatment beyond mercury tonics that often killed faster than the disease itself. Some women tried crude preventatives, douching with vinegar or lye solutions that caused more harm than good. Others simply resigned themselves to their fate, figuring they'd be dead of violence or overdose long before the pox could claim them. Pregnancy was another constant fear. Children born to saloon girls faced a bleak future, if they survived birth at all. Most women tried to prevent conception through various folk remedies and dangerous procedures. When those failed, there were back-alley abortionists who operated with rusty instruments and no understanding of sanitation. Mary had held the hands of women who bled to death from botched procedures, their last words often apologies to children they'd never have the chance to raise. The psychological damage was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse, the constant degradation, the need to perform pleasure while feeling nothing but revulsion, the daily humiliation of being treated as less than human. It all combined to create a kind of spiritual death that preceded the physical one by years. Mary found herself developing multiple personalities as a survival mechanism. There was the seductive temptress who could make any man believe he was the only customer she'd ever truly desired. There was the tough frontier woman who could drink any cowboy under the table and trade insults with the best of them. There was the vulnerable victim who could inspire protective instincts in lonely men looking for someone to save. And buried deep beneath all these masks was the real Mary, the farm girl who'd once dreamed of marriage and children, and a little house with flowers in the garden. That buried self grew smaller and quieter with each passing day, until sometimes Mary wondered if it still existed at all. She'd catch glimpses of her former self in unexpected moments, when she saw a mother with her child on the street, when she heard a hymn drifting from the church on Sunday morning, when she watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold and remembered how beautiful the world could be when viewed through innocent eyes. But those moments of recognition were becoming rarer, replaced by a cold pragmatism that viewed every human interaction as a transaction to be negotiated. She'd learned to calculate the precise amount of whiskey needed to make a customer manageable without making him dangerous. She could assess a man's wealth to the penny within minutes of meeting him, and she knew exactly which lies would separate him from the maximum amount of money. The other women recognized this transformation in Mary, and it earned her a grudging respect. She was becoming one of them, a survivor who traded her humanity for another day of life. But survival in this world came with a price that compounded daily, and Mary was beginning to understand that some debts could never be repaid. The violence that surrounded them was as routine as breathing. Barely a week passed without a shooting, a stabbing, or a beating that left someone permanently maimed or dead. The local law enforcement was either corrupt, incompetent, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. Justice, when it came at all, was usually dispensed by vigilante committees more interested in quick resolution than careful investigation. Mary had witnessed horrors that would have broken her mind just months earlier. She'd seen men killed over card games, women beaten to death by customers who'd paid for the privilege, and children sold into slavery by their own parents. The frontier was a place where the veneer of civilization was paper thin, and beneath it lurked appetites and cruelties that civilized society had supposedly left behind. Yet even in this hellish environment, human connections still formed. The women looked out for each other in small ways, sharing medicine when someone was sick, covering for each other when exhaustion made work impossible, providing comfort when the weight of their existence became too much to bear alone. These bonds were fragile and often temporary, but they were sometimes the only thing that stood between survival and complete despair. Mary had formed a particular friendship with Rebecca, the older woman who'd become something of a mentor. Rebecca had survived longer than anyone had a right to expect in this business, and she'd done it by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around her. She taught Mary the finer points of manipulation, how to make a customer feel special while picking his pocket, how to convince a violent man that hurting her would somehow diminish his own masculinity, how to spot the signs that it was time to move on to a new town before the old one consumed her completely. But Rebecca also carried the weight of her experiences in ways that served as a warning to the younger women. Her laugh had a brittle quality that suggested madness lurking just beneath the surface. She talked to herself in quiet moments, carrying on conversations with people who existed only in her memory. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her face would crumple with a grief so profound that it seemed to age her decades in an instant. The seasonal rhythms of frontier life brought their own challenges and opportunities. Spring meant cattle drives and mining expeditions, bringing fresh customers with money to spend. Summer brought the heat and the smell and the increased tensions that came with too many people crowded into too small a space. Fall brought the harvest workers and the last desperate attempts to strike it rich before winter set in. And winter brought isolation, cabin fever, and the kind of desperation that made men do things they'd never consider in more civilized circumstances. Mary learned to adapt to these rhythms, adjusting her strategies based on the type of customers the season brought. Cowboys fresh off the trail required different handling than miners celebrating a lucky strike, or gamblers working their way through the circuit of frontier towns. Each group had its own codes, its own vulnerabilities, and its own particular brand of violence. The economic realities of saloon life were harsh and unforgiving. Kate took the largest cut of everything. Room, board, clothing, medicine, and protection all came with inflated prices that kept the women perpetually in debt. the cost of a simple dress was marked up to 5 times its actual value. Medicine for syphilis or other diseases cost more than most women made in a month. Even basic necessities like soap and clean water came with fees that made escape seem impossible. Some women tried to supplement their income through gambling, but the games were usually rigged against them. Others attempted to save money by cutting back on food or medicine, but malnutrition and untreated diseases made them less attractive to customers, creating a downward spiral that was almost impossible to escape. The smartest women, like Rebecca, found ways to skim money without Kate's knowledge, charging customers extra for special services and pocketing the difference, selling information to rival establishments, or running small side businesses like laundry or mending. But these activities were incredibly risky, and women caught stealing from Kate faced punishments that made the everyday brutality of saloon life seem gentle by comparison. Mary watched one woman, a quiet girl named Elizabeth, get caught selling information about Kate's customers to a competing establishment. Kate's response was swift and merciless. Elizabeth was beaten unconscious, her face deliberately scarred with a knife to make her unmarketable, and then turned out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. In a frontier town with no social services and limited economic opportunities for women, this was essentially a death sentence. The message was clear. Kate owned them completely, and any attempt to assert independence would be met with destruction. This psychological control was perhaps more effective than physical chains, because it convinced the women that escape was not just difficult, but impossible. Yet even under these conditions, some women managed to find ways to resist. They formed secret alliances, shared information about escape routes and safe houses, and slowly accumulated the resources necessary for freedom. It was a delicate and dangerous process that required years of planning and an enormous amount of luck. Mary began to realize that survival in this world required thinking in terms of decades rather than days. The women who lasted longest were those who could maintain hope while simultaneously accepting the brutal realities of their situation. They planned for escape while expecting to die, saved money while spending freely enough to avoid suspicion, and formed relationships while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to betray those same people if survival demanded it. This psychological balancing act was perhaps the most difficult aspect of saloon life, more challenging than the physical abuse, more devastating than the diseases, more soul-crushing than the daily humiliation. It required a kind of split consciousness that allowed a woman to function in an impossible situation while maintaining just enough humanity to remember what she was fighting to reclaim. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher against the windows of Big Nose Kate's establishment, Mary found herself changing in ways that both frightened and empowered her. She was becoming someone she'd never intended to be, but also someone who might actually survive long enough to become someone else entirely. The question was whether anything of her original self would remain when that transformation was complete. The brutal mathematics of frontier survival were becoming clearer with each passing day. In this world, sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed. Trust was a weapon that others would use against you, and hope was both the most necessary and most dangerous emotion a woman could harbor. Mary was learning to navigate these treacherous waters with increasing skill, but she was also beginning to understand that mastery of this environment came with costs that might prove impossible to calculate until it was far too late to change course. The story of the Wild West Saloon was not just one of individual degradation, but of a system that consumed human beings as efficiently as the mines consumed workers, or the cattle drives consumed livestock. It was a machine designed to extract value from desperation, and those caught in its gears had to become part of the machine itself or be destroyed by it. The crisp morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and desperation as Mary Sullivan counted the last of her earnings from the previous night. $23.16, barely enough for another week's rent in the cramped boarding house room she shared with 2 other women who worked the circuit, But in the unforgiving world of Wild West saloons, where survival depended on cunning as much as beauty, Mary had learned that desperation could be the most dangerous luxury of all. By the winter of 1882, Mary had been working the saloon circuit for nearly 4 years, long enough to understand the brutal mathematics of her profession. She'd seen girls arrive fresh-faced from failed homesteads or broken families, their eyes still holding traces of innocence and hope. Most lasted 6 months before the combination of violence, disease, and soul-crushing exploitation broke them completely. The lucky ones found a way out through marriage or death. The unlucky ones simply disappeared into the endless cycle of frontier towns, each one a little more desperate than the last. The hierarchy within Big Nose Kate's establishment was as rigid and unforgiving as any military structure, with survival depending entirely on understanding one's place in the pecking order. At the top sat Kate herself, a woman whose sharp business acumen was matched only by her capacity for calculated cruelty. She had clawed her way up from the bottom rungs of the profession, and she ensured that every girl under her roof understood that mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford to dispense. Below Kate were the favoured girls, those who had managed to cultivate regular customers with deep pockets and relatively gentle dispositions. These women enjoyed better rooms, nicer clothing, and a degree of protection from the worst excesses of frontier violence. They were the aristocracy of their degraded world, and they guarded their privileges with the jealous intensity of courtiers protecting access to a king. Mary occupied the dangerous middle ground, established enough to avoid the worst treatment reserved for newcomers, but not so favoured as to enjoy true security. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which customers might prove violent, which ones carried diseases that would spell her doom, and which ones might be convinced to part with a little extra money for special treatment. It was a delicate dance of manipulation and survival, performed night after night on a stage where a single misstep could prove fatal. The newest arrivals lived in a state of constant terror, sleeping in the worst rooms, servicing the most dangerous customers, and receiving the smallest portion of their earnings. Kate used them as a warning to the other girls, a constant reminder of what awaited those who failed to maintain their value to the establishment. These unfortunate souls were often farm girls who had fled abusive families or economic desperation, only to discover that their new circumstances represented a different kind of hell entirely. The daily routine began before dawn, when the girls would emerge from their cramped quarters to begin the endless cycle of preparation that their profession demanded. Those who had survived long enough to afford it would spend precious minutes applying the rouge and powder that helped maintain the illusion of health and youth. The newer girls made do with whatever scraps of cosmetics they could borrow or steal, often sharing a single broken mirror between 3 or 4 women. Breakfast, when it existed at all, consisted of whatever stale bread or thin gruel Kate felt inclined to provide. The women had learned to supplement this meagre fare through whatever means they could manage, trading favours for extra food or pooling their resources to purchase supplies from the general store. Hunger was a constant companion, deliberately maintained by Kate as another tool of control. A hungry woman was a compliant woman, less likely to cause trouble or attempt escape. The afternoon hours were spent in maintenance tasks that kept the saloon functioning. Floors needed scrubbing, glasses required washing, and the constant stream of tobacco juice and spilled liquor demanded attention. But these chores were merely the prelude to the evening's main event, when the saloon would fill with cowboys, miners, gamblers, and drifters looking for whatever pleasure their money could buy. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the transformation would begin. The women would change into their working clothes, garish dresses designed to attract attention and suggest availability. They would arrange their hair, apply what makeup they possessed, and steel themselves for another night of performance. For that's what it was, ultimately, a carefully choreographed performance designed to separate men from their money, while maintaining the illusion of desire and pleasure. The evening shift brought its own set of challenges and dangers. Each customer represented a potential threat, whether from violence, disease, or simple refusal to pay. The women had developed an elaborate system of signals and codes to warn each other of particularly dangerous individuals, but even this network couldn't guarantee safety. Too often, Mary had watched as a girl would disappear upstairs with a customer, only to emerge hours later bearing fresh bruises or worse. Kate maintained order through a combination of fear and strategic violence. She employed a handful of men whose job it was to handle customers who became too violent or refused to pay, but their protection came with its own price. These enforcers expected their own compensation, whether in the form of money or services, and the women had no choice but to comply. It was simply another layer of exploitation in a system designed to extract value from their bodies and souls. The constant threat of disease hung over the establishment like a dark cloud. In an era before antibiotics or proper medical understanding, sexually transmitted infections were often death sentences delivered slowly and painfully. The women lived in constant fear of the telltale signs that would mark them as damaged goods, knowing that Kate would cast them out at the first indication of serious illness. They had seen too many of their number waste away from syphilis or other maladies, abandoned to die in whatever squalid corner they could find. Violence was another ever-present spectre. Cowboys flush with money and whiskey could turn dangerous without warning. Their romantic notions of the frontier, often including the belief that women in their profession deserved whatever treatment they received. Knives flashed in poorly lit rooms, fists connected with faces and bodies, and the women learned to endure pain as simply another cost of their profession. Those who fought back often found themselves facing Kate's wrath as well as their attackers, caught between two forms of brutality with no safe harbor. The economic exploitation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of their situation. Kate took the largest portion of each woman's earnings, claiming it as payment for room, board, clothing, and protection. What remained was barely enough to survive, let alone save for escape. The women found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, owing money for everything from their dresses to their meals, never able to accumulate enough resources to leave. It was economic slavery disguised as employment, and Kate had perfected the system to ensure maximum profit with minimum rebellion. Yet even within this brutal system, the women found ways to resist and maintain their humanity. They formed alliances based on mutual protection and shared resources, pooling their knowledge about dangerous customers and reliable sources of extra income. They created elaborate codes for communicating during work hours, warning systems that could save lives or prevent violence. These networks of solidarity were perhaps their most valuable possessions, more precious than money or clothing in a world that sought to isolate and dehumanize them. Mary had learned to navigate these treacherous waters through careful observation and strategic thinking. She had identified which customers were most likely to pay well and treat her decently, and she cultivated these relationships with the skill of a diplomat managing international relations. She learned to read the signs of impending violence and developed techniques for diffusing dangerous situations before they escalated. Most importantly, she had begun to save money, hiding small amounts in locations that Kate would never think to search. The psychological toll of this existence was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. The women lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, never able to truly relax or let down their guard. They learned to dissociate during their working hours, sending their minds elsewhere, while their bodies performed the required functions. Many turned to alcohol or laudanum to numb the pain, trading temporary relief for long-term addiction. Others simply retreated into themselves, becoming hollow shells that went through the motions of life without truly living. The rare moments of genuine human connection became precious beyond measure. A customer who treated them with basic human dignity, a conversation that went beyond the transactional, a moment of laughter shared with another woman, these small incidents of humanity stood out like beacons in an otherwise dark landscape. The women treasured these experiences, holding on to them as proof that they were still human beings, deserving of respect and kindness. Sleep, when it came, was often fitful and interrupted. The thin walls of the boarding house provided little privacy or quiet, and the sounds of ongoing business below stairs served as a constant reminder of their circumstances. Nightmares were common, filled with images of violence and degradation that their conscious minds tried to suppress. Many of the women suffered from what we would now recognize as symptoms of trauma, their nervous systems permanently altered by the constant stress and danger of their environment. The changing seasons brought their own challenges and opportunities. Winter meant fewer travelers and less business, which could mean starvation for those without savings or regular customers. But it also meant fewer dangerous encounters and more time to rest and recover. Summer brought increased traffic as cowboys drove herds to market, and miners emerged from their claims. But it also brought more violence and competition among the women for the available customers. The women developed sophisticated strategies for managing their earnings and expenses. They learned to negotiate with Kate for better terms, to identify customers who might be willing to pay premium prices for special services, and to find ways to supplement their income through activities that fell outside Kate's direct control. Some became skilled at cards or dice, earning extra money through gambling. Others learned to sew or cook, trading these skills for money or favors. The most entrepreneurial among them even began to establish their own small businesses, selling items or services to other women in the trade. Information was another valuable commodity in their world. Knowledge about which towns offered better working conditions, which madams were more or less exploitative, which routes were safest for travel, all of this intelligence was traded and shared among the women like currency. They maintained networks that stretched across the frontier, passing along warnings about dangerous customers or opportunities for better employment. These communication networks were vital for survival, providing early warning systems for threats and opportunities for advancement. The legal system offered no protection for women in their situation. Law enforcement officials were often customers themselves, and the courts viewed prostitutes as criminals rather than victims. The women learned to handle disputes and violence through their own means, developing informal justice systems that operated outside the official legal framework. They became skilled at gathering evidence of wrongdoing, organizing collective action against particularly abusive customers or employers, and protecting themselves through solidarity rather than relying on external authorities. Religion played a complex role in their lives. While many had been raised in Christian households and retained some faith, they also faced constant condemnation from religious authorities who viewed them as sinful and irredeemable. Some found comfort in private prayer or the belief that God understood their circumstances even if other people didn't. Others rejected religion entirely, seeing it as just another system designed to oppress and control them. A few found alternative spiritual practices that offered solace without judgment, drawing on folk traditions or indigenous beliefs that emphasized healing and renewal. The women who survived longest in this environment were those who learned to compartmentalize their experiences, maintaining a core sense of self that remained untouched by their professional activities. They developed elaborate mental techniques for protecting their emotional and psychological integrity, creating internal spaces where they could retreat when the external world became too brutal to bear. These survival mechanisms were sophisticated forms of psychological self-defense, honed through necessity and refined through experience. Mary had watched enough women succumb to the pressures of their environment to understand that survival required more than just physical endurance. It demanded a kind of mental toughness that allowed one to endure degradation without being destroyed by it, to maintain hope in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances, and to continue planning for a better future even when such dreams seemed impossible. She had seen women break under the strain, their minds snapping like overstressed cables, and she was determined not to join their ranks. The bonds formed between the women were often deeper and more meaningful than any relationships they had experienced in their previous lives. United by shared trauma and common purpose, they developed loyalties that transcended the artificial competition that Kate tried to foster among them. They became mothers, sisters, and daughters to each other, creating surrogate families that provided emotional support and practical assistance. These relationships were often the only source of genuine love and care in their otherwise brutal existence. As Mary counted her money that morning, she wasn't just calculating her immediate financial situation. She was planning her escape, working through the complex logistics of leaving the circuit and starting a new life somewhere far from the saloons and brothels of the frontier. She had been saving for 2 years, hiding money in a dozen different locations, building up the resources she would need to disappear completely and reinvent herself as a respectable woman with a different name and history. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. She would need enough money not just for travel, but for clothing, lodging, and living expenses, while she established herself in a new location. She would need new identity papers, a plausible story about her background, and the skills necessary to earn an honest living. Most importantly, she would need the psychological strength to leave behind the only life she had known for years and start completely over in a world that would never accept her if they knew the truth about her past. But Mary had learned that hope was not a luxury she could afford to abandon. In the darkest moments of her existence, when the violence and exploitation seemed overwhelming, the dream of escape had sustained her. She had seen other women successfully make the transition to respectable life, though they had to carefully guard their secrets forever after. It was possible, difficult and dangerous, but possible. And for Mary Sullivan, that possibility was worth any risk. The morning light streaming through the grimy window of her boarding house room illuminated more than just the dust motes dancing in the air. It revealed a woman who had been forged in the crucible of frontier brutality, but had somehow maintained her essential humanity. She had learned to navigate a world designed to destroy her, had found ways to resist and survive in circumstances that would have broken many others. And now, after years of careful planning and patient endurance, she was finally ready to reclaim her life and her future. The brutal world of the Wild West Saloon had taken much from Mary Sullivan, but it had not taken everything. She still possessed her intelligence, her determination, and her unshakable belief that she deserved something better than the life that circumstances had forced upon her. As she prepared for another day in Kate's establishment, she carried with her the secret knowledge that it would not be her life forever. Mary's fingers trembled as she counted the coins in her palm. 3 silver pieces and a handful of copper pennies. It was more money than she'd seen in months, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Not in a place like Deadwood, where a shot of whiskey cost more than most folks back home earned in a week. The saloon loomed before her, its painted facade already chipped and weathered despite being barely 2 years old. The gilt edge, they called it, though Mary could see precious little gilt on its rough-hewn exterior. Through the batwing doors came the sounds that would become the soundtrack of her new life. Raucous laughter, tinkling piano keys, the clink of glasses, and underneath it all, a current of desperation that seemed to permeate everything in this God-forsaken frontier town. She clutched her worn carpet bag tighter and stepped inside. The assault on her senses was immediate and overwhelming. Tobacco smoke hung thick as morning fog, mixed with the cloying scent of cheap perfume and the sour smell of spilled beer. Men crowded around felt-covered tables, their faces hard and weathered. eyes constantly shifting between their cards, and the women who moved between them like colourful moths drawn to dangerous flames. And there, behind the bar, stood the woman who would determine Mary's fate. Big Nose. Kate was exactly as Mary had imagined, and nothing like she'd expected. Tall and imposing, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, she commanded the room with a presence that made grown men step aside without thinking. Her dress was fine silk, deep burgundy that spoke of money and power, but her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd clawed her way up from nothing and intended to stay there. Kate's gaze found Mary immediately, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of someone who'd sized up countless desperate women over the years. The threadbare dress, the too thin frame, the way Mary's knuckles showed white as she gripped her bag, but also the straight spine, the defiant tilt of her chin, the flash of intelligence in green eyes that refused to look away. "You must be the farm girl," Kate said, her voice carrying easily over the din. It wasn't a question. Mary walked forward on unsteady legs, keenly aware that every conversation in the saloon had stopped. Men turned to stare openly, some with curiosity, others with the hungry look of predators scenting fresh prey. The working girls watched too, their expressions ranging from pity to calculation as they assessed this new competition. Kate stepped around the bar with fluid grace, circling Mary like a buyer examining livestock. "Turn around," she commanded, and Mary obeyed, heat flooding her cheeks as Kate's critical gaze swept over her. "Scrawny," Kate pronounced finally, "but that can be fixed with proper feeding. Good bone structure, clear skin under all that travel dust." She lifted a strand of Mary's auburn hair, testing its texture. 18, Mary whispered. 18, Kate repeated, amusement colouring her tone. "Of course you are." She released Mary's hair and stepped back. The blunt question hit Mary like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, her face burning with shame and confusion. Kate's laugh was harsh but not entirely unkind. "That's answer enough." She turned away, already losing interest. "Pearl!" A woman detached herself from a table of card players and sauntered over. Pearl was perhaps 30, with bleached blonde hair and painted lips, wearing a dress of shocking pink satin that left little to the imagination. Her smile was practiced and empty, but her eyes weren't entirely cruel as they assessed Mary. Pearl asked, "This one's Mary." Kate's tone brooked no argument. "Get her cleaned up, fed, and explain the rules." As Pearl led her toward a narrow staircase at the back of the saloon, Mary caught sight of her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The young woman staring back looked terrified and very small, dwarfed by the chaos around her. But there was something else there too, something that even Kate had missed in her assessment. A hardness that hadn't been there when Mary had left the farm 3 weeks ago, forged in the crucible of loss and desperation that had driven her to this place. The stairs creaked under their feet as they climbed to the second floor, Pearl's heels clicking against the worn wood. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, lined with doors that bore the evidence of rough use, gouged wood, broken hinges hastily repaired, stains that Mary preferred not to think about. "Here we are," Pearl said, pushing open a door near the end of the hall. The room was small and cramped, dominated by a single bed with a sagging mattress and threadbare quilt. A washstand stood in one corner, its basin cracked but clean, and a small window looked out onto the muddy street below. It wasn't much, but after weeks of sleeping rough on the trail, it looked like luxury to Mary. Pearl sat heavily on the bed, the springs protesting with a metallic squeal. "Sit down, honey." Mary perched nervously on the room's single chair, still clutching her bag. "First things first," Pearl began, her voice taking on a weary, businesslike tone. "Forget whatever romantic notions you might have about this life. This ain't no adventure, and there ain't no heroes coming to rescue you." She pulled a small bottle from her dress pocket and took a swig before continuing. Kate runs a tight operation here. She's fair enough, I suppose, but she's harder than winter nails and twice as sharp. Cross her, and you'll find yourself out on the street faster than you can blink. Mary's voice was barely a whisper. Pearl's smile was grim. Honey, there's always worse. Kate protects her girls because we make her money, but that protection has limits. You step too far out of line, and she'll sell you to the first mining camp that'll take you. The weight of her situation settled over Mary like a physical thing, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. I don't. Yes, you can, Pearl said firmly. Because you have to. Whatever brought you here, it was bad enough that this seemed like your best option. So you're going to learn the rules, you're going to follow them, and you're going to survive. Pearl stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water from a pitcher into the basin. Now, let's get you cleaned up. First rule, always stay clean. As Mary stripped off her travel-stained dress, Pearl continued her grim education. Second rule, never trust the customers. They might sweet-talk you, might even convince you they care, but at the end of the day, you're just meat to them. The water was cold, but Mary welcomed the shock of it against her skin. As she scrubbed away weeks of dust and grime, she felt like she was washing away the last remnants of the girl she'd been. Mary Sullivan from the farm was gone. What emerged from that basin was something harder, something that could survive in this world of casual cruelty and purchased affection. Third rule, Pearl continued, handing Mary a clean towel. Never let them see you break. They can smell weakness like wolves smell blood, and they'll use it against you every time. You cry, you do it in private. You hurt, you keep it to yourself. Pearl pulled a dress from a small wardrobe, shaking it out for Mary's inspection. It was made of cheap blue cotton, but it was clean and it fit more or less. The neckline was lower than anything Mary had ever worn, and the skirt was shorter, but it was respectable compared to some of the outfits she'd seen downstairs. This'll do for now, Pearl said, helping Mary with the buttons. Mary asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Pearl's laugh was bitter. Honey, there's only one kind of work for girls like us in a place like this. As if summoned by their conversation, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, followed by a sharp knock on the door. Time's up, came Kate's voice through the thin wood. Mary's hands shook as she smoothed down her skirt. This was it, the moment when her old life truly ended and this new, terrifying existence began. Pearl squeezed her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but only emphasized how alone Mary truly was. The door opened, and Kate stepped inside, her critical gaze immediately fixing on Mary. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the bedraggled farm girl, replaced by a young woman who, while still obviously inexperienced, showed definite potential. Better, Kate pronounced. Much better. She walked around Mary again, adjusting the dress here and there, pulling Mary's hair back to better show her face. Yes, I think you'll do quite well. The men like a fresh face, especially one with such... The way she said the word innocence made Mary's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain still under Kate's examination. Now then, Kate continued, let's discuss your situation. You owe me for room, board, and clothing. You'll work off that debt at a rate I determine, plus interest. Mary asked, finding her voice. Kate's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh, my dear, everything costs money here. The bed you'll sleep in, the food you'll eat, the dresses you'll wear, even the soap you just used. $20. Mary's heart sank. It might as well have been 20,000. At the wages she'd made on the farm, it would take her months to earn that much, and that was before paying for her daily needs. I can see you're doing the arithmetic, Kate said with amusement. Don't worry, you'll earn it back quickly enough. A pretty girl like you, fresh and unspoiled. The full horror of her situation crashed over Mary like a wave. She was trapped, caught in a web of debt and desperation with no way out. The money she'd thought would give her freedom had instead purchased her slavery. But as despair threatened to overwhelm her, something else stirred in Mary's chest. A spark of the same stubbornness that had driven her to leave the farm in the first place. She might be trapped for now, but that didn't mean she had to stay trapped forever. She would learn the rules of this game, and then she would find a way to win it. "I understand," she said quietly. Kate nodded approvingly. "Good. I like a girl who can face reality without hysterics. You'll start tonight, working the floor." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Mary, welcome to the Gilt Edge." As Kate's footsteps faded down the hallway, Mary sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Pearl sat beside her, offering the bottle again. "Take a drink," Pearl advised. Mary accepted the bottle and took a small sip, gasping as the whiskey burned its way down her throat. But Pearl was right. It did help, spreading a warm numbness through her chest that made everything seem slightly less terrifying. Mary asked. 3 years, Pearl replied. "Came out from Chicago after my husband died." Pearl's laugh was hollow. "Every day, but thinking and doing are two different things. Kate's got her hooks in deep, and the debt just keeps growing." "Some do," Pearl admitted, "usually by marrying a customer or dying." Mary was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. Pearl looked startled. "Before you became Pearl." For a moment, Pearl's carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing a glimpse of the woman she'd once been. "Elizabeth," she whispered. "Pretty names don't pay the bills out here," Pearl said, her walls snapping back into place. "Come on, we need to get you ready for tonight." As Pearl began explaining the intricacies of working the saloon floor, how to encourage men to buy drinks, how to deflect unwanted advances without losing potential income, how to read the signs of trouble before it escalated into violence, Mary found herself studying the older woman's face. Beneath the paint and powder, she could see the lines of weariness and resignation, the toll that 3 years in this life had taken. She thought about Elizabeth Morrison, whoever she had been before she became Pearl. What dreams had she once harbored? What hopes had she buried beneath layers of rouge and false smiles? And more importantly, what would Mary Sullivan have to bury to become whoever Kate needed her to be? The sun was setting outside their small window, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Mary painfully of home. Soon, the real work would begin. Soon, she would have to descend those stairs and face the hungry eyes and grasping hands of men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be purchased. But for now, in the fading light of her last day of innocence, Mary allowed herself one final moment to grieve for the girl she'd been and the life she'd lost. Tomorrow, she would begin the long, brutal process of learning to survive in a world that devoured the weak and discarded the broken. The sounds from below were growing louder as the evening crowd began to arrive. Boots on wooden floors, the scrape of chairs, voices raised in laughter and argument. Pearl stood and smoothed down her dress, checking her appearance in the small mirror above the washstand. She asked. Mary looked at her reflection one last time, memorizing the face of the farm girl who had walked into the Gilt Edge that afternoon. That girl was gone now, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. Someone who would do whatever it took to survive. "Ready," she said. And with that single word, Mary Sullivan stepped across the threshold into a world where innocence was currency, survival was victory, and hope was the most dangerous luxury of all. The saloon waited below, filled with men who would try to break her spirit and women who had already learned the price of dreams. But Mary had something they didn't expect: the iron will of a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. In the brutal mathematics of frontier justice, that might just be enough to tip the scales in her favor. By dawn's first light, Mary Sullivan had already begun her daily routine, though routine hardly captured the calculated precision required for survival in Madame Kate's establishment. The bruise on her left cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green, a parting gift from a drunken cattle baron 3 nights prior. She pressed cold creek water against her swollen lip, wincing as the sting reminded her of the delicate balance between resistance and compliance that defined every interaction in this world. The saloon sat like a cancer on the edge of deadwood, its weathered clapboard walls housing secrets that would make even the most hardened prospector blanch. Inside these walls, women like Mary existed in a brutal hierarchy, where survival meant navigating the treacherous waters between violent clientele, jealous competitors, and the iron-fisted rule of Big-Nose Kate herself. The Madame ran her establishment with the efficiency of a military commander and the ruthlessness of a frontier judge, dispensing punishment and reward with equal measure. Mary had learned quickly that in this world, trust was a luxury that could get you killed. The other girls were both allies and enemies, depending on the night, the client, and the amount of money at stake. Sarah, the redhead from Missouri, had warned her about the traveling salesman who liked to use his belt for more than holding up his trousers. In return, Mary had shared the knowledge that Judge Morrison paid double for discretion about his particular proclivities. Information was currency, and currency meant the difference between eating beans and salt pork or going hungry for another night. The physical toll was obvious to anyone with eyes. Mary's hands, once soft from her father's farm, were now calloused from scrubbing floors and fighting off unwanted advances. Her back ached constantly from sleeping on a thin mattress shared with rats and the occasional scorpion. But the psychological warfare was far more insidious. Kate had perfected the art of keeping her girls dependent, advancing them money for clothes and medicine, then charging interest that ensured they could never work off their debt. It was slavery with extra steps, wrapped in the veneer of choice and opportunity. The dangers came from every direction. Clients who mistook payment for ownership, often leaving bruises and worse as calling cards. Rival establishments would sometimes send thugs to rough up Kate's girls, eliminating competition through intimidation and violence. The law offered no protection. Sheriff Coleman was one of Kate's regular customers, and his deputy had a taste for young brunettes that Mary was careful to avoid. Disease stalked the halls like a spectre, from the pox that could mark a girl for life to the consumption that claimed at least one woman every winter. Then there were the unwritten rules that governed survival. Never steal from a client, no matter how drunk or how wealthy. Never show weakness in front of the other girls. Never cross Big-Nose Kate, whose legendary temper had once resulted in a girl being thrown down the stairs with a broken arm. Always have an escape plan, even if you never intended to use it. Mary had been squirreling away coins for months, hiding them in a loose floorboard beneath her bed, dreaming of the day she could buy passage on a westbound stage and disappear into anonymity. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a town built on the dreams of striking it rich, the women in the saloon were mining their own bodies for gold that would never be theirs to keep. Every night brought fresh humiliation and danger, but also the slim possibility of accumulating enough money to escape. Some girls gave up hope entirely, surrendering to the laudanum and whiskey that made the nights bearable, but the days meaningless. Others, like Mary, clung to the belief that this was temporary, a necessary hell to endure before reaching something better. As the sun climbed higher over the dusty streets of Deadwood, Mary finished her morning ablutions and prepared for another day in paradise. She would sweep the floors, polish the brass spittoons, and help Kate count the previous night's earnings. She would smile at the rough men who propositioned her before noon, deflecting their advances with practiced coquetry. She would tend to whatever injuries the other girls had sustained, applying salve to bruises and listening to whispered plans of revenge or escape. But most importantly, she would survive another day, adding another $1 to her hidden stash, moving one step closer to the freedom that seemed as distant and shimmering as a desert mirage. Mary's hands trembled as she carefully applied powder to cover the fresh bruises on her throat. 3 weeks had passed since Big Jim's attack, and the marks were finally fading to yellow-green shadows that makeup could mostly hide. The mirror reflected back a face she barely recognized anymore. Hollow cheeks, eyes that had lost their spark, skin that seemed permanently pale despite the rouge she applied each morning. The establishment had returned to its usual rhythm of violence and desperation, but something fundamental had shifted in the hierarchy. Word of Mary's survival had spread through the network of saloons and brothels like wildfire. She had stared down Big Jim Mitchell and lived to tell about it. That kind of reputation was currency in their world, dangerous currency that could either elevate or destroy. Madame Lorraine watched Mary with calculating eyes these days, measuring her worth differently. A girl who could handle the worst without breaking completely was valuable. A girl who might inspire others to resist was a threat. Mary felt this precarious balance every time the older woman's gaze lingered on her, weighing options, considering possibilities. The new girls looked at Mary with a mixture of awe and terror. She had become a cautionary tale and an inspiration simultaneously. During their brief moments together in the cramped quarters they shared, Mary found herself dispensing advice she wished she'd never had to learn. How to read a man's eyes before his hands moved. Which regulars were merely rough and which were genuinely dangerous. Where to keep a blade hidden in the folds of a dress. Sally had grown more brazen since the incident, her natural defiance emboldened by Mary's example. It worried Mary deeply. Sally was still too fresh, too quick to anger, lacking the calculated patience that survival demanded. The girl's Irish temper flared at every slight, every groping hand, every crude comment. Mary tried to teach her the art of strategic submission, the careful dance of appearing compliant while maintaining inner resistance. "You can't fight them all," Mary whispered to Sally one evening as they prepared for the night's work. But Sally's green eyes blazed with the same fury Mary remembered feeling in her early days. "How can you just let them touch you?" Mary's hands stilled on the buttons of her dress. How could she explain that the smiling was armor, that the pretending was survival, that every night she didn't die was a small victory? How could she tell Sally that the alternative to strategic compliance was often a shallow grave behind the saloon? The clientele had grown more unpredictable as winter approached. Harsh weather drove men indoors, concentrating the violence and desperation within the saloon's walls. Cowboys, stranded by early snows, drank away their last coins before facing the brutal journey home. Miners, flush with gold dust, or bitter from empty claims, sought solace or release in the temporary companionship the girls provided. Mary had learned to read the barometric pressure of masculine rage, the way tension built in the main room before erupting into chaos. She could sense when a card game was about to turn deadly, when a drunken argument would escalate to gunfire, when the brittle civility that barely contained these men's worst impulses would finally shatter. On those nights, she guided the newer girls away from the storm centers, steering them toward the safer corners of the room, or finding excuses to retreat upstairs. It was a delicate art, this navigation of violence, requiring perfect timing and an understanding of mob psychology that most women would never need to acquire. The money she'd managed to save remained hidden in its various locations, growing slowly but steadily. Each coin represented hours of degradation endured, violence survived, dignity sacrificed on the altar of eventual freedom. She calculated and recalculated the sum needed to buy her way out, accounting for inflation, bribes, and the inevitable obstacles that would arise when she finally made her move. But freedom seemed more elusive now than ever. The territory was changing rapidly, but not necessarily in ways that favored women seeking independence. New laws were being written by men who viewed women like Mary as problems to be solved, rather than people to be protected. The growing respectability of the settlements meant less tolerance for the grey areas where desperate people had once found refuge. Mary had heard stories of other girls who'd tried to leave, to start fresh in distant towns. Some had succeeded, reinventing themselves as seamstresses or shopkeepers' wives, their pasts buried beneath layers of carefully constructed respectability. Others had been tracked down by former clients or madams, dragged back to face brutal punishment for their attempted escape. The most sobering stories were of those who'd made it out only to find that the skills they'd acquired in the saloons were useless in the respectable world. Women who couldn't read well enough to work in shops, who flinched at unexpected touches, who'd forgotten how to smile without calculation. Some had voluntarily returned to the life they'd tried to escape, finding it preferable to starvation or complete isolation. Mary's reading lessons with Dr. Hartwell continued when possible, though the sessions had become more sporadic and cautious since Big Jim's attack. The doctor seemed to understand the increased danger she faced, the way her newfound reputation as a survivor had painted a target on her back. Their meetings were brief and focused, covering practical skills like basic arithmetic and letter writing, alongside the slow progress through various texts. "Education is armor," Dr. Hartwell told her during one of their sessions, his voice heavy with the weight of things he couldn't say directly. Mary understood the subtext. He was preparing her for escape, giving her tools she'd need in a world beyond the saloon's walls. But he was also careful never to encourage her directly, never to promise assistance that might put them both at risk. Their relationship existed in the narrow space between compassion and complicity, bounded by the harsh realities of their respective positions. The other girls watched these interactions with varying degrees of suspicion and envy. Education was a luxury most of them couldn't afford to pursue, even if the opportunity arose. They were too exhausted, too traumatized, or too convinced of their own worthlessness to believe that learning could change their circumstances. But Mary had seen enough of the world beyond the saloon to know that knowledge was indeed power, that the ability to read and write and calculate could open doors that remained closed to the illiterate. She hoarded these skills as carefully as she hoarded her coins, understanding that both would be necessary for any successful escape. The approaching winter also brought news from the outside world that filtered through the saloon's walls like smoke. Railroad companies were pushing further west, bringing with them the promise of civilization and the threat of change. Towns that had once existed on the edges of lawlessness were being incorporated, their wild reputations cleaned up to attract investment and respectable settlers. Mary listened to these conversations with mixed feelings. Civilization might mean better laws, more protection for women, opportunities for legitimate work. But it also meant increased scrutiny, less tolerance for establishments like Lorraine's, and potentially fewer places for women with questionable pasts to disappear and start over. The delicate ecosystem of frontier vice was beginning to shift, and Mary knew she needed to position herself carefully for whatever came next. The skills she'd learned in the saloon, reading people, managing dangerous situations, navigating complex social hierarchies, might translate to respectable employment if she could find a way to reframe them appropriately. But first, she had to survive long enough to make that transition. And survival meant continuing to play the deadly game of frontier prostitution, balancing the competing demands of clients, madams, and her own desperate need for autonomy. It meant enduring the nightly degradations while maintaining enough of herself to remember why escape mattered. As Mary prepared for another night's work, checking the placement of her hidden blade and practicing her most disarming smile in the cracked mirror, she reminded herself that each day survived was a small victory. Each coin saved brought her closer to freedom. Each lesson learned expanded her options for the future. The bruises on her throat were nearly gone now, but the memory of Big Jim's hands remained vivid. It served as both trauma and motivation, a reminder of how much worse things could get and how desperately she needed to find another way. Tomorrow she would continue the careful work of survival and escape. Tonight she would endure whatever came, secure in the knowledge that endurance itself was a form of resistance. The sound of piano music drifted up from the main room below, signalling the beginning of another night in the brutal theatre of the Wild West Saloon. Mary clutched the faded letter from her sister back east, the ink smudged by countless teardrops over the past 3 months. The promise of steady work and a chance at independence had seemed like salvation when she first stepped off that dusty stagecoach into Deadwood. But as she stood in the dim lamplight of Big Nose Kate's establishment, adjusting her corset and painting her lips with trembling hands, Mary knew the brutal reality was far more complex than any letter could convey. The hierarchy within these frontier establishments was as rigid and unforgiving as the landscape itself. At the top sat the Madame, a woman who had either clawed her way up from the bottom ranks or possessed enough capital and connections to establish her own operation. Big Nose Kate ruled her domain with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves, her weathered face bearing the scars of countless battles fought in dimly lit rooms and smoke-filled saloons. She had survived 3 different mining booms, 2 cholera outbreaks, and more violent customers than she cared to remember. Below the Madame came the senior girls, veterans who had earned their positions through a combination of survival instinct, business acumen, and sheer endurance. These women commanded the best rooms, the wealthiest clients, and a measure of respect that bordered on fear. They had learned to read men like open books, knowing instinctively which ones would pay well and leave quietly, and which ones might turn violent after too much whiskey. Mary found herself among the middle tier, neither fresh enough to command premium prices, nor experienced enough to navigate the treacherous waters with complete confidence. She shared cramped quarters with 3 other women, their personal belongings crammed into battered trunks and their dreams slowly eroding with each passing day. The competition among them was fierce, yet unspoken, each woman knowing that a single misstep could send her tumbling down to the bottom rung of this precarious ladder. At the very bottom were the new arrivals, the desperate, and the broken. These women often worked for little more than room and board, their earnings swallowed by inflated charges for clothing, cosmetics, and medical care. The Madame kept meticulous records of every debt, every expense, ensuring that escape remained perpetually out of reach. Some girls arrived voluntarily, drawn by promises of easy money and independence. Others had been abandoned, widowed, or cast out by families who could no longer support them. The daily routine began before dawn, when the last of the previous night's customers had finally stumbled out into the cold morning air. Mary would wake to the sound of Bertha, the establishment's cook and enforcer, banging pots in the kitchen below. The smell of strong coffee and bacon grease would drift up through the floorboards, mingling with the lingering odours of tobacco, whiskey, and unwashed bodies that seemed permanently embedded in the building's walls. Personal hygiene was both a necessity and a luxury in this environment. The women shared a single wash basin and mirror, taking turns to scrub away the remnants of the previous night's work. Water was often cold, and soap was expensive, making cleanliness a constant challenge. Mary had learned to be resourceful, using vinegar to rinse her hair and baking soda to clean her teeth, tricks passed down from the older women who had survived longer than most. The Madam conducted daily inspections with the cold efficiency of a military commander reviewing troops. She examined each woman's appearance, checking for signs of disease, injury, or defiance. Any blemish, any hint of illness, any suggestion that a woman might not be able to perform her duties would result in immediate quarantine, or worse, expulsion onto the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. Breakfast was a hurried affair, usually consisting of weak coffee, stale bread, and whatever scraps remained from the previous evening's meals. The women ate in relative silence, each lost in her own thoughts, preparing mentally for another day of survival. Conversation, when it occurred, was usually practical in nature, discussing which customers to avoid, sharing information about new arrivals in town, or warning each other about potential dangers. The afternoons were spent in preparation and maintenance. Clothing required constant mending, as the cheap fabrics and rough handling took their toll. Mary had become skilled with needle and thread, patching tears and reinforcing seams with whatever materials she could find. The women also used this time to practice their craft, sharing techniques for managing difficult customers, discussing strategies for maximizing earnings, and looking out for each other's safety. As evening approached, the transformation began. The tired, worn faces of the afternoon gave way to painted masks of allure and availability. Lips were reddened with beetroot juice or expensive rouge. Eyes were lined with kohl, and cheeks were pinched to create a healthy flush. Corsets were laced tight to create the desired silhouette, and what little jewelry the women possessed was carefully arranged to catch the lamplight. The customers who frequented these establishments came from every walk of frontier life, each bringing their own particular brand of danger and desperation. The miners arrived with gold dust in their pockets and months of loneliness weighing on their souls. These men could be generous when their claims were paying well, but they were also prone to violent mood swings when the drink took hold. Mary had learned to spot the warning signs, the way a man's eyes would grow distant and cold, the subtle changes in posture that preceded an outburst. The cowboys presented a different set of challenges. Fresh off the trail after weeks or months of driving cattle across hostile territory, they were usually looking for more than just physical comfort. They wanted conversation, human connection, someone to listen to their stories of stampedes and river crossings, of nights spent under vast skies filled with more stars than seemed possible. But they could also be demanding and rough, their hands calloused from rope and leather, their manners shaped more by life among animals than civilized society. Business travelers and salesmen often proved to be the most unpredictable customers. Some were genteel and courteous, treating the women with a measure of respect that was rare in this environment. Others harbored dark fantasies and twisted desires that they would never dare express in their respectable lives back east. Mary had learned to be especially cautious with these men, as their veneer of civilization could mask truly dangerous impulses. The gamblers formed another distinct category, men who lived by cards and dice, whose fortunes could change with a single hand or roll. When they were winning, they were generous to a fault, showering the women with gifts and attention. But when luck turned against them, they could become bitter and violent, seeing the women as convenient targets for their frustration and rage. Local merchants and officials presented their own unique challenges. These men often demanded discretion above all else, fearing that their reputations in the community might be damaged if their visits became known. They could be valuable regular customers, but they also wielded significant power in the town's legal and economic structures, making them dangerous enemies if crossed. Perhaps the most feared customers were the drifters and outlaws, men who lived outside the law and had little regard for human life. These individuals often carried the violence of their chosen profession into their personal interactions, treating women as objects to be used and discarded. The smart madames tried to screen such men out, but in desperate times, when money was scarce, even the most dangerous customers might be reluctantly accommodated. The physical dangers faced by the women were constant and varied. Violence could erupt without warning, triggered by alcohol, frustration, or simple cruelty. Broken bones, black eyes, and worse were occupational hazards that the women learned to treat with whatever folk remedies and patent medicines they could obtain. The nearest doctor might be days away, and even if medical help was available, it often came with judgment and condescension that made the cure worse than the disease. Disease was perhaps an even greater threat than violence. In an era before antibiotics or proper understanding of hygiene, sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly through these communities. The symptoms could be devastating, leading to blindness, madness, and death. Women who showed signs of illness were often cast out immediately, left to die alone and forgotten. Those who remained lived in constant fear of contamination, using whatever primitive protection they could devise. Pregnancy represented another form of catastrophe in this environment. Children were not welcome in these establishments, and the madames had no interest in supporting women who could not work. Desperate measures were often taken to prevent or terminate pregnancies, using dangerous herbs, crude instruments, or the services of back-alley practitioners whose methods were more likely to kill than cure. Many women died from botched procedures, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves on the outskirts of town. The psychological toll of this life was perhaps the most devastating aspect of all. Day after day, the women were forced to smile and perform intimacy with strangers, to pretend desire where there was only revulsion, to maintain a facade of happiness while their souls slowly withered away. Many turned to alcohol or laudanum to numb the pain, creating addictions that made escape even more difficult. Some women found ways to cope by compartmentalizing their experiences, creating mental barriers between their working selves and their true identities. Others formed deep bonds with their fellow workers, creating surrogate families that provided emotional support in an otherwise hostile world. The smartest ones began planning their escapes from the moment they arrived, carefully hoarding every penny and cultivating connections that might eventually lead to freedom. Mary had developed her own survival strategies over the months since her arrival. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a customer's mood and intentions, adjusting her approach accordingly. With the lonely miners, she offered a sympathetic ear and gentle conversation. With the rough cowboys, she projected strength and confidence. With the dangerous outlaws, she remained alert and submissive, never challenging their authority or giving them reason to turn violent. She had also begun to build alliances with other women in the establishment. Sarah, a veteran who had survived 5 years in various frontier towns, had become something of a mentor, teaching Mary the tricks of the trade and warning her about the worst customers. Together with 2 other women, they had formed an informal network of mutual protection, watching out for each other and sharing information about potential threats. Financial management had become a crucial skill in Mary's arsenal. The madam charged exorbitant rates for room, board, clothing, and medical care, keeping detailed records of every debt and expense. Many women found themselves trapped in a cycle of perpetual indebtedness, working harder and harder just to stay even. Mary had learned to be frugal with her earnings, carefully tracking every penny and looking for ways to reduce her expenses. She had also begun to explore alternative sources of income. Some of the women supplemented their earnings by sewing, cooking, or providing other services to the local community. Others invested in small business ventures, pooling their resources to buy and sell goods. Mary had discovered that she had a talent for writing letters for illiterate customers, helping them communicate with family members back home. This small service brought in a few extra coins and gave her a sense of purpose beyond her primary occupation. The question of escape was never far from Mary's thoughts. She had heard stories of women who had managed to leave this life behind, finding respectable work, or marrying men who were willing to overlook their past. But for every success story, there were dozens of tales of women who had tried to escape, only to be dragged back by debts, violence, or simple lack of alternatives. Some women attempted to flee in the dead of night, taking only what they could carry and hoping to reach the next town before being discovered. Others tried to accumulate enough money to buy their freedom, though the madames were skilled at finding new expenses and charges to keep their workers trapped. A few managed to form relationships with customers who offered to help them start new lives, though such arrangements often proved to be just another form of exploitation. The legal system offered little hope for protection or justice. Women in Mary's position had few rights and even fewer advocates. Law enforcement officials were often customers themselves, creating obvious conflicts of interest. Judges and lawyers viewed these women as morally compromised and unworthy of serious consideration. The social stigma attached to their work followed them wherever they went, making it difficult to find legitimate employment or acceptance in respectable society. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Mary refused to abandon hope entirely. She had begun to keep a diary, recording her experiences and observations in the hopes that someday her story might serve as a warning or inspiration to others. She also maintained correspondence with her sister back east, carefully editing her letters to avoid revealing the true nature of her situation while trying to maintain some connection to her former life. The other women in the establishment had their own dreams and strategies for survival. Some spoke of saving enough money to open their own businesses, perhaps a boarding house or restaurant in a more civilized town. Others dreamed of finding love with a man who could see past their circumstances to the person underneath. A few had given up on escape entirely, focusing instead on achieving some measure of security and status within the confines of their current existence. The madam herself represented both an inspiration and a warning to the women under her control. Big Nose Kate had clawed her way up from the bottom of the hierarchy, using intelligence, ruthlessness, and sheer determination to build her own empire. She commanded respect and wielded significant power within the community, proving that women could succeed in this harsh environment. But she had also paid a terrible price for her success, sacrificing relationships, health, and perhaps her soul in the pursuit of survival and dominance. As the weeks turned to months, Mary began to notice subtle changes in herself and her fellow workers. The constant stress and danger had hardened them all, stripping away innocence and illusions with relentless efficiency. They learned to trust no one completely, to always be alert for signs of trouble, to suppress their emotions and desires in favor of cold calculation. Some women seemed to fade away entirely, becoming hollow shells going through the motions of life without any real spark or passion. But Mary also observed remarkable displays of courage, compassion, and resilience among her companions. Women who had every reason to become bitter and selfish instead looked out for each other, sharing resources and providing emotional support. They celebrated small victories together and mourned losses as a community. In the face of overwhelming adversity, they had created their own forms of dignity and meaning. The changing seasons brought new challenges and opportunities to the frontier town. Winter meant fewer travelers and customers, but also increased danger from cold, storms, and isolation. Spring brought renewed activity as prospectors returned to their claims and cattle drives resumed. But it also meant increased competition as new women arrived seeking work. Summer was usually the busiest time, with long days and steady streams of customers, but the heat and dust made working conditions even more unpleasant. Through it all, Mary continued to adapt and survive, drawing on reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of the establishment, building alliances and avoiding conflicts that could prove dangerous. She developed a reputation for discretion and reliability that earned her better treatment from both customers and management. Most importantly, she never lost sight of her ultimate goal: to escape this life and build something better for herself. The path forward remained uncertain and fraught with danger, but Mary had learned that survival itself was a form of victory in this unforgiving environment. Each day that she managed to preserve her health, her sanity, and her hope was a small triumph against overwhelming odds. She had discovered reserves of courage and cunning that surprised even herself, and she had formed bonds with other women that gave her strength to continue fighting. As she prepared for another evening of performance and survival, Mary touched the small locket hidden beneath her corset, a reminder of the life she had left behind and the future she still hoped to claim. The brutal realities of frontier life had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, but they had also revealed the depths of her own resilience and determination. So the harsh reality was that for most who lived through these brutal times, death came early and without mercy. Disease, famine, violence, and sheer exhaustion claimed countless lives before their time. The fortunate few who survived to old age bore the scars of a lifetime spent struggling against impossible odds, their bodies broken by decades of backbreaking labor, their spirits somehow still flickering with the stubborn hope that had carried them through the darkest of days. Yet it was precisely this unyielding resilience, this quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable hardship, that defines their legacy and reminds us of the extraordinary strength that lies within the human spirit when tested by the very worst that life can offer.